I don't have a list of questions or anything in
No,
particular to go through.
Oh, all right. Well, I have produced some. I have, but I did for the past couple of days. Actually, I had a couple of trials that I was going through. So during a break, what I did, I said, okay, let me. I want to make sure that I'm understanding the concepts right. So what I did is I went to your blog post and then just to see how these things are generally defined, and then belief claims, knowledge claims, and the relationship between the two. Like, what is agnosticism? What is atheism? And just how colloquially people were using these terms. So then I came up. I said, okay, as the way that I've usually been trained to evaluate arguments is take one piece of the argument and determine, okay, if this is true, what must also be true and what must also be false about this one statement. And then I evaluate everything else based on that thing that has to be true or has to be false. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'll screen share, but here's my I just put them in Excel spreadsheets. So what I did is I'll screen share so I can show you exactly what I did when I was. Can you see my screen?
No. Oh yeah.
All right. So what I did is and this is just I just took knowledge, belief, understanding that knowledge is a subset of belief, and that if you made it a Venn diagram, knowledge would be the all-encompassing, and belief would be all-encompassing, and knowledge would just be the little piece of it inside the circle. But the relationship, if you're talking about just the sufficiency and necessity, would be if you have knowledge, then you have belief. Impression that had to be true, that must be true. All knowledge claims are inherently belief claims.
Yeah.
So I said, okay, well, if that's true, then what else could I derive? What else could I know is true? So the first thing I said was, okay, the contrapositive of that, if knowledge then belief, if the contrapositive must also be true. So that's why you see the other green. If not belief, then not knowledge. It's just a straight contrapositive.
Mm-hmm.
So then I said, well, from that, could I determine what must be false? So then, if you have knowledge, then you don't have belief. That is something that must have been false. And then if you don't have belief, then knowledge, that also must be false. So this is kind of how I broke this down. What must be true, what must be false, and the things that could be true or could be false, which is the other ones we used to the T and F. I don't want to bore you with going through the whole table, but that's how I produced this table.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Are you now? You want me to go on, or is there anything?
Yeah. That seems uncontroversial to me so far.
All right. So then what I did is I said, okay, well, let me now organize it in what can belief claims tell me, what can not belief claims tell me, what can not knowledge claims tell me, what can knowledge claims tell me, what other conclusions can I make just off of those? So I said, well, if I take belief claims, it seems based on the logic table is that beliefs can't tell you anything about knowledge. If you believe something, it could be true that you don't have knowledge, it could be true that you have knowledge. It doesn't really tell you anything about knowledge, it just tells you about the belief. And similarly, that you don't have knowledge, then it doesn't tell you anything about a person's belief claim.
Yeah.
And belief, it might not be true the person believes. The only absolutes that you can gather from belief and knowledge claims if you actually don't have belief. If you don't have belief, the one thing that must be true is you don't have knowledge. That must be true in all circumstances.
Yeah.
But similarly, if you have knowledge, then you must have belief. That must also be true. And obviously, just the negation of not, if you don't have belief and you have knowledge, that must be false. Similarly, if you have knowledge and don't have belief, that must be false. So this was some of the conclusions that I came up with. First, belief claims could tell you nothing about knowledge, and not knowledge claims can't tell you anything about belief. Anything controversial about this, or
no? Well, it seems like it's pretty much the same stuff, just packaged up slightly differently.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, I agree with all of that.
So this is still the same stuff packaged up. Instead of just changing this is where it may get a little controversial. I just use, instead of knowledge, the word knowledge, I use agnostic. Instead of belief, I use theism, because I thought theism was just inherently a belief claim. I believe in X. Gnosticism is I know X, I know God exists versus I believe God exists. So I'm just putting those terms replacing knowledge, belief, not knowledge, not belief, not Gnostic, not theism. The next table. Now this is weird. Go ahead.
But no, carry on.
Oh, all right. So then I just inputted those terms into the table and was just saying, well, if someone says they're theist, it doesn't tell me anything about their knowledge, because even though they have the belief, theist, you tell me nothing about whether you have knowledge this thing exists or not, because obviously, based on the principles I kind of laid out earlier, belief claims can tell you nothing about knowledge. Similarly, if you're not Gnostic, then it really can't tell you anything about your belief claims. If you're Gnostic, it doesn't point me to what you believe. The only truth that I can gather from this is that if you're not a theist, then you have no belief. That must be true. And if you are Gnostic, if you have knowledge, then you are, by definition, a theist.
Okay, so the idea is if your position is that you know that God exists, then it follows that you believe that God exists.
Correct.
And if you don't believe that God exists, then you don't know that God exists.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, fine.
So then again, I just changed the prefix from not to a and agnostic, and so it's the same table, just obviously just the terms atheism and agnostic are changed out for not Gnostic and not atheism. This one I just changed the term. This adds not theism to the chart, because some people are saying, well, not theism is the way I'm defining not. I mean, not theism is non-theism. So I was just adding that to just to show the relationship. But this is where I got into the trouble, because in defining atheism as now a belief claim, and the way I want to explain this is simple. Generally, in court, you have it's true the defendant is either guilty or innocent, but the evaluation is of guilt versus not guilt. And I want to use, and I think this analogy is perfect for the disagreement that I had with Steve and some of the other people, is that the evaluation I was understanding between atheism and theism was an evaluation between guilty and not guilty. Mm-hmm. Now the evaluation that others are presenting is not between guilt and not guilty, it's between guilt and innocence. One side is saying the person's guilty, the other side is saying the person's innocent. So we're evaluating it differently. I'm only evaluating the guilt claim, where it seems like everyone else is saying atheism means the belief that God does not exist, is really evaluating the innocence claim. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So now, when I added as a belief claim to this chart, just to see if it logically follows, because now it's a belief claim. I believe gods do not exist. Again, if you just follow it just logically, then that belief cannot tell you about what the person knows. It just tells you that the person believes gods do not exist. But similarly, similarly for agnostics, it's still, by somebody saying they're agnostic, they haven't told you about what they believe. You just don't know. If someone says I'm agnostic, you don't know what they believe based on this truth table. Also, not theism now is the position. If somebody says they're not theist, they are in fact agnostic. A not theist is an agnostic. And again, a Gnostic, someone who has knowledge, is an atheist. So here you can have a Gnostic atheist. Does that make sense?
Let me just check. In this final table, how do you make it stick on the screen when I'm talking? Because
I'll remove it. Okay. Do you want me to remove it?
If you can keep it up so that I can see it whilst I'm talking, that would help.
Sure. Can you see it now?
Yeah, but now it's going off the screen when I talk still.
Present me. If you could present me.
How do I do that? Is that this? Okay, that seems to be working now. Okay, good. So, so did you say on this table that then you changed atheism to be a positive belief claim that no God exists?
Yeah, I'm defining atheism as the belief that no gods exist. So it's a positive belief claim. I believe that no gods exist.
Okay, so then the first line says if atheism, then agnostic, right? And you've got the result
Yes.
as well. It doesn't tell you either way. But if atheism
Correct.
is positive belief that no God exists,
Okay.
then yeah, I guess you don't it doesn't necessarily tell you that. Yeah. Okay. So it feels to me like you've got more parameters bouncing around than you've captured properly with this. So like, because there's there's two poles in there, right? I could believe that God exists or believe that God doesn't exist, right?
Correct.
And I can have knowledge that he does and knowledge that he doesn't.
Correct.
From the hard atheist position, you can at least derive the fact that I'm agnostic in your sense about, in the sense I don't have knowledge that God does exist. I can't, right? That's at the far end of opposition. Right? If I believe that God doesn't exist, I don't know that he does exist, right? So there is a type of agnosticism that's ruled out, right? And if agnostic really means a possession, having both, lacking a belief in either proposition, right? It means that I don't believe that God exists, and I don't know that he exists, and I don't know that he doesn't. Right. Simply having the positive belief that he does is enough to rule out agnosticism. You see what I mean? It only rules out one half of agnosticism. But if agnosticism is both, then hard atheism does rule out agnosticism. Does that make sense?
Okay, can you say that one more time?
So, agnosticism is a position about the proposition being true and the proposition being false, right? And it's that you don't believe either of those two.
Correct.
Right. Hard atheism is the position that the proposition is false. Right. So from somebody being hard atheist, you can rule out them being an agnostic, because for them to be an agnostic, they'd have to lack the belief that God doesn't exist. The hard atheist has that belief. So from being a hard atheist, you should be able to infer that they're not an agnostic. It shouldn't be open. It shouldn't be something that you can't decide. And what's going on in your table is, if you're a hard atheist, what you can rule out is not that they're agnostic. It's that they're not agnostic about. So what you're saying is, if someone positively believes that God doesn't exist, then they don't necessarily have knowledge that God doesn't exist, right? It's whether or not they know that proposition is false. If they believe that it's false, that doesn't mean that they know that it's false.
Yes,
that's all you're saying.
Yes, and I think maybe the word agnostic here may have been the wrong word to use, because this is knowledge about the claim. I believe no gods exist. So if you have knowledge that claim is true versus not knowledge that claim is true, you don't know that claim is true versus you know the claim is true. It's not really agnosticism to the claim, to the theistic claim that I believe gods exist. This is agnosticism just toward the claim that I believe no gods exist. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I feel like at this point while this way of breaking it down is quite useful, I think that it's sort of creaking under its weight as it gets more complicated. And because what we're not doing at this point is clearly representing exactly what. So we've got, on the one hand, we've got the belief that somebody might have, and then the content of their belief, the thing that they're, the proposition, which is the thing that they either believe or not. And this way that you're presenting it doesn't keep those two things clearly separated and clearly explicit throughout. So I think while it is very clear, I think it's crucial. What it's not quite expressing correctly is, it seems to me, having all of the pieces completely open to the air, as it were, all the way through, so we can keep track of everything, all these moving parts. And I just find it's a little bit misleading to say, if atheism, then you can't say if atheism, then agnostic, like that it's just either one of those two. If atheism, as in hard atheism, then you should be able to derive not agnostic. It seems to me.
Okay. and that might be the problem with putting, instead of not belief or not knowledge, using the term agnostic, because, and that's why I think this fails, and this is probably the trouble I was having, because when I was looking at this and defining it as agnostic, it seemed to me to not make sense, because agnostic, in this sense, in this table, agnostic is really just representing the knowledge. Does a person, I'm saying Gnostic, what Gnostic represents on this chart is someone saying, I know gods do not exist, but that's really not the term to use, and I shouldn't have used that term. I should have just put belief instead of, I'm not belief, knowledge instead of Gnostic and agnostic. So I definitely agree. The terms that I'm using are incorrect. I was actually trying to institute what a person knows versus what a person does not know. So yes, I do understand how it's confusing in that sense, because Gnosticism means the belief that God exists. I mean, the knowledge that God exists. So yes, so this does not work, because it's the words are being used. The word Gnostic and agnostic are not being used properly.
Well, I think it's so. This whole point is about what the correct use of those terms is. So, I mean, like, as we agreed, I think earlier, maybe before we started, that there really is there's no such thing as like a correct definition, in a sense. There's, any word can be used to mean anything, and in normal language, words don't always have a completely fixed and unalterable meaning, and there can be more than one meaning in a community for the same or similar words, and they kind of overlap with each other and change. And that's why when you look up a meaning of a word in a dictionary, it has lots of different entries, and if you pick up a dictionary from 10 years ago, they'll be slightly different in some cases from they are now. So, like, we realize that you can't, there's no such thing as a logical definition, right? All definitions are just stipulated to some extent. So what the purpose of this argument is to try and say that there's a kind of order that you should impose that makes a kind of system. And is this right? And then following from those principles of the system, it just seems to make sense. Well, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth. This isn't the end of the presentation.
What it was the reason why I think we were my understanding of the argument against, because my understanding is that I was trying to understand if I was using the word atheism wrong, in the sense of it being a lack of belief, or I do not believe God does exist. So I was just trying to, and my understanding was, okay, this seems to be correct, but now how can, is it what am I missing? So that's why I kind of said, let me flush it out to see, because it seems like there was a majority, well, not even majority, there seemed to be a group of people who were saying, okay, the way this word is being used seemed to be incorrect. So then when I read your blog post, and then I kind of flushed it out, I was like, okay, well, this seems to be correct. Well, then let me take the other part and see if that seems to be correct. And they both, again, I think they both are correct. But then speaking to, again, people in the community, they kept, it kept saying, well, number one, in using atheism as a lack of belief, some of the refutations were, one was that it doesn't tell you what the person believes. So if someone says, well, I'm an atheist, I do not believe gods exist, that doesn't tell you what the person believes. But then going back just to the standard chart, where we're using just the standard terms of not, then an agnostic would also, by definition, logically, would not tell you, if somebody says I'm agnostic, then they're not telling you what they believe either. So I was trying to wrap my head around, well, how come, in the sense of using atheism as a lack of belief, that's the refutation, that doesn't tell you what you believe. But then if someone says I'm agnostic, that also doesn't tell you what the person believes, but that's acceptable. So I was trying to understand it in those kind of parameters. Why is it in one scenario it works? Why is it in another scenario it doesn't work? And is it something logically missing in this evaluation?
Yeah, so I don't think there's anything logical about that. So the question is, okay, so if somebody says to you, do you believe that God exists or something, and you say, well, I'm an atheist, and and by atheist, what you mean is someone who lacks the belief that some God exists. is true, right? So I just simply lack that belief. So someone says, hey, do you believe that God exists? And you say, I'm an atheist. Then the objection is supposed to be, well, in that case, we are still not quite sure what your outlook is. Like, are you someone who's on the fence by it, or are you someone who possesses the positive belief that that proposition is false, right? So that seems to be the objection, and so that's cashed out as being like, well, we still don't know what you believe. And I think that you're completely right in saying, like, if you say, if somebody says to you, do you believe that God exists? And you say, hey, I'm an agnostic, then you're quite right to point out that, I mean, presuming agnostic means at the very least you don't believe that the proposition is true and you don't believe that the proposition is false, then all you've been told is two things that you don't believe. And that doesn't add up to something that you do believe, right? That's also a label that doesn't have a positive belief connotation with it as well. So, I mean, and then your question is, well, why is it okay for the agnostic to be able to say something which doesn't reveal a positive belief, but you're not allowed to say something? Because, you know, it can't just be that the reason is that you're not allowed to say things that don't reveal your positive beliefs, right? Because otherwise the agnostic would be suffering from the same criticism that the atheist is, on your view. Is that right? That seems to summarize it up to them. Okay.
Yes.
And I think the response is that, like, yeah, okay, so in the same way that that atheism is an umbrella term for you, it covers both people who lack a belief in either direction and people who lack the positive belief but possess the negative belief, right? The hard atheist. So we've got, under that umbrella term of atheists, you've got agnostics and hard atheists, right? Well, so if we define agnostic as somebody who doesn't believe the proposition is true and doesn't believe that the proposition is false, there's actually an umbrella. That's also an umbrella term, right? Because there's some people who simply lack the belief because, say, they haven't thought about it before, or they think that the terms are meaningless, or because they think that for some reason or another they can't find out that answer, right? It's sort of hidden from them metaphysically. So there's a soft atheist who's someone who says, like, well, I don't know, I don't believe in either direction, but, you know, maybe I will tomorrow. And then there's a hard atheist, a hard agnostic who says, I don't believe in either direction now, and I can't believe, right? So not only does the agnostic, not only is the agnostic someone who's not telling you what they believe, it's also an umbrella term between two different positions, a hard and a soft position. Right? So it's, in many ways, it's open to both of those criticisms that your definition of atheism was facing. So I think you're quite right to push back on that. And ultimately, all we're talking about here is some kind of like slight inconvenience at the beginning of a conversation. Like, if somebody asks you, do you believe that some gods exist? And you say, I'm an atheist. Then, okay, maybe they don't know exactly what you mean, but they can always say, do you mean hard atheist or lack theist, right? And then you can explain. So what we're talking about is like a kind of pragmatic thing. Like, are you being polite when you respond in this way that you say, I'm an atheist, and you don't distinguish it? To some extent, it's sort of, you could see it as like maybe unnecessarily kind of restrained in the amount of information that you're giving back. I think that might be one way of looking at what the complaint is here. It's certainly not a logical complaint.
Okay, no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off at the true finish point. I apologize. No, I definitely understand that, and I definitely agree. This is the failing of maybe my career too, being, you know, when someone asks a particular question, I've always been trained that if someone answers that question directly, then either you've not asked the right question, or you need to be, you know, well, if the person answers your question directly, then you seem not to ask the correct question. If someone says, do you believe in God? And if I say anything else other than yes, then you know that I'm not a theist, I'm something else. If I say atheist, then you know that I'm rejecting that claim. But if you want to know my theological position, whether I'm, you know, agnostic or something else, I think the proper question wouldn't be the culture, then do you believe God exists? You say, well, what's your position on the God question? Or, you know, to force me to then answer the question that to answer the question that you really want answered. You know, you can't ask me a question And I'm sorry, this is just the way I've always thought of it. You can't ask me a question that directs one answer, and I give you that answer, and then complain that my answer is not specific enough because the question that you've asked it it allows me to answer it in such a way where I can completely answer your question without being any more specific. Now, I understand that may not be that, there may be a little like, oh, well, you could have just told me you were agnostic, or you could have just told me you didn't believe God exists, or you could have told me that you hold this positive belief. But if you're only asking if I believe this proposition, I tell you no, then it's hard for me to understand the complaint when you could have asked the question to get the answer that you received.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that, do you believe that God exists, is a closed question. There's two answers, right? Yes and no. And I think no is a perfectly acceptable answer in that context, but you're allowed to say no. The question is, I suppose, whether or not saying that you're an atheist is equivalent to saying no in that context, or whether it says something more. And in history, throughout history, being an atheist means more than just saying no to that question of whether or not you believe that God exists. It means something like the claim that God doesn't exist, right? Saying,
Yeah.
so if you look at somebody like Nietzsche or Heidegger or Sartre or Bertrand Russell, when they say they're an atheist, they don't mean that they just simply lack a belief, right? Nietzsche's like, God is dead, right? God is dead, meaning not, we lack a belief in him, but we've killed God. He's dead. He doesn't exist now. It's a very, very powerful, strong form of atheism. That's philosophical pedigree of atheism. But it's undeniable, of course, that there's a wave of this second definition, right, of lack theism coming through, where it just means the lack of a positive belief, right? Okay, so let me see if I can. How do I share my screen? What do I do? Present to everyone?
Yeah, let me stop sharing my screen.
And then now what do I do?
Hold on, let me stop sharing my screen. That might help. All right.
What else do I do to share my screen?
On the upper left-hand corner, you'll see the little green arrow. Click that.
Okay, I think I figured it out. Yeah, cool. Okay, so look, this is my blog post. Let me just explain what this diagram is, right? Let me scroll up a bit. So the idea is this is a scale of belief in the proposition that God exists or not, where some God exists. And the idea is 0.5 is the middle point, 1 is the sort of maximal degree of belief in the proposition being true, and 0 is the maximal lack of degree of belief in the proposition being true, right? And then we can think about this, some vaguely defined area in the middle underneath 0.5 where you lack a belief that P is true, and you lack a belief that not P is true, right? Now it seems to me that that this region isn't just an infinitesimally thin line directly under 0.5, because I think I can lack a positive belief in something even though I think it's more likely to be true than its negation, right? And then, so an example for this, I'm interested to see if you follow this intuition as well, but my intuition pump is the following example, right? So you take a deck of cards and randomly remove one card, and it's the ace of spades, say, and then you throw that away and randomly take another card without looking at it. Now, because there's one fewer black card than red, you know that the chances that the next card is red is greater than that it's not red, right? The odds are like something like 0.52 to 0.48. More or less the breakdown of the percentage of vote over Brexit. But anyway, what that means is it's very slightly more likely to be a red card than to be a black card.
Yes, because you change the probability by removing one card.
Yeah, but still, you might say the probability of it being a red card is almost exactly the same as it being black. It's slightly more likely to be red than black, but it's such a small difference that it's not enough for me to be able to say that I believe the next card is going to be red. Right? I'm completely indecisive about what color the next card is going to be, even though it's very slightly more likely to be red than black. So I think that's a situation where I have a positive degree of belief in the card being red, but I lack a belief in the card being red, right? So I don't believe that the card is red. My degree of belief that the card is red is 0.52. So it would be, just to the right of the 0.5 line. And I think that that counts as being still inside this gray area where I lack a positive belief in either direction. Now, just before I carry on, does that seem intuitive to you, or do you
Yes.
find that?
No, it makes 100% sense, because what you're doing is by changing the subset, you're adding more information, and by having more information, it changes your confidence in your belief claims. Well, even though there is one less black card in the deck, and you can't predict whether the next card is going to be red or black, but you still, even though you believe, you can't say definitively that you believe the next card is going to be red or black. You do believe that it's more likely to be red because you've changed the subset.
Yeah.
Is that all right?
That's it, exactly. So I think it's more likely, but I don't believe that it's true. And at a certain point, if I was to keep removing black cards from the deck, so there was only one black card left and the rest of them are red, I still wouldn't know for sure that it's going to be red, but I would believe certainly that the next card is going to be red, right? The chances of it being black would be very small at that point. And I don't think that there's a precise way of cashing out that difference from when you go from not believing something to believing something. And I don't think that you can just put a number on it and say that's true for everyone, for every proposition at all times, right? That's just not how it works. The boundary between when you change your mind from not believing something to believing something is kind of fluctuates chaotically and is very difficult to track, and we shouldn't bother trying to put numbers on that too precisely. But what you can do, I think, is just say that sooner or later, as you extend up the number line or down the number line, you eventually step out of that gray area where you don't believe in either direction and eventually kind of come across the point where you do believe, right? So after enough black cards being removed from the deck, sooner or later I'm going to start believing that the next one will be red. Right? I'll start expecting the next one to be red, and I'll have enough confidence for me to be able to say, I believe the next card is red. Okay.
Can I ask you just a quick question? But even with the example in the cards, I do agree that eventually you go from not belief to belief, and that variation, it's you wouldn't be able to put a number in it, but would saying that, let's say you pull out the last red card, and and all the cards in the deck are black, would that be now the edges of this particular diagram, the 0 and the 1?
Yeah.
That would be the, but then because even when we talk about these belief claims, it's hard to go from that belief to knowledge subset too, because I don't think you'd ever be in a position to have absolute knowledge in the same way, like a set of cards versus, say, the God claim. You understand what I mean?
Yeah, that's fair enough. I mean, in this case, we would have a method that would sort of be able to prove that the next card would be red, right? By at least if you knew going into it that it has whatever it is, 26 of each, and you removed 26 red cards, that kind of proves that the next card has to be black, right? So in that case, I think it's fair enough to have like complete certainty in it. I guess you could question whether or not you're dreaming, or that barring philosophical skepticism, right? You'd be about as sure about that as anything you could be. So we want to stick our credence towards 1 at that point, I think.
Okay.
Okay. So then, and the thought is that so knowledge on either side is just a kind of, as you were talking about before, it's a subset of belief, right? It's like I think there's more to knowledge than this, but it seems right that as you become more and more confident of something, you're more likely to say that you know it. And I think that certainly when we get around to that point of saying that the next card is going to be black because all of the cards that remain in the deck are black, we certainly would be claiming to know it at that point. I think we also claim to know things far less likely than that. You know, you could forgive someone for thinking that they knew that the Conservatives were going to win in the UK general election that happened the other day. Everyone seemed convinced that that was going to happen. It was just how many seats of a majority they would get. And people would say, yeah, I know that Theresa May will return with a majority or something. They hadn't had deductive proof for that. Obviously, it didn't happen. So they didn't have deductive proof, but they were still confident enough to say that they know it. Right? So there's some relationship between, you know, knowing something entails a higher degree of confidence or higher degree of belief than merely believing something. Right?
So would it be fair to say that belief, if I say I believe something, that is the lowest position of confidence that a person can have in the truth of a proposition, where if I say I know something, then you're talking about a higher level of confidence in the truth of that proposition, or if it's false, true or false.
Well, so believing, so for me to believe that P is true here means that my degree of belief is higher than 0.5 and lower than whatever the, well, I suppose, yeah, it just means that it's somewhere greater than 0.5.
All right, got it.
I think saying that it's the lowest degree of belief you can have in the proposition is misleading, because I could have a degree of belief of 0. And I've stopped believing in the proposition a long time before we get there, right? So believing in something means that you have a positive degree of belief about it, which is properly greater than 0.5.
Okay. So zero is no belief. 1 would be absolute knowledge, and this diagram is showing the traveling from absolutely no belief to total confidence, which is full knowledge.
Yeah, so this towards the 0 end of the scale, I know that it's not true. Then I guess I go slightly further up. I stop feeling like I know it. I'm still confident to say that I believe that it's not true. In this middle bit, I don't want to say that I believe it's true. I don't want to say that I believe it's not true. Then as we increase towards 1, I begin to say I believe it. And then even further up, I start to say that I know it.
I think we look Alex. So let's give him a couple seconds to get back in.
Did I drop out then?
Yes, you did. Yes, you dropped out.
Okay, so I don't know at what point
You dropped that at the point. You dropped that at the point where you just explained that it went from the chart was going from 0 to 1, and then you're explaining why the chart wasn't explaining why it wasn't a degree of why the degree of confidence wasn't the proper evaluation of belief to knowledge.
So I wasn't on this bit yet.
No, you were right before this bit.
Oh,
Hold on, no. Go back. You were up a little bit. No, you weren't at this point yet.
Okay, sorry. So
you were at the chart. Go down. You were about here. You're at the chart before that one. Up a little bit more. This is where you're at.
Okay, so we've got. Okay, so let me see if I can remember. So so we're talking about a scale, right? The ranges from 0 through 1 of confidence in the proposition being true, where 0 is full confidence that the proposition is false, and 0.5 is complete indecision on the issue, and 1 is complete full yes. degree of belief that it's true, right? And what I'm trying to do here is explain the relationship between this continuous degree and these black and white terms, knowing which is either true or false, believing which is either true or false, and not believing or whatever, which is all of these parts under here are binary, whereas this is continuous. So there's this question about how do you combine this, on the one hand, a degree of belief with this black and white sense of believing or not believing. So let's just come down to this. So this is, I think, a way of thinking about the lack theist position. So we are, so the way this is cutting the pie is that a theist is anyone who's got a positive degree of belief. So anyone whose degree of belief is strong enough for it to be true that they believe the proposition is true. Right? And so anyone who affirms or believes that some God exists, and anyone who knows that some God exists. Right? So it's this entire bracket up here. An atheist is just everybody else. So anyone whose degree of belief is less than enough to qualify for them having a positive belief. So basically anyone who lacks a belief.
So anybody who says no to the problem, anyone who says no, or anybody who doesn't answer yes to that question would be on this chart considered an atheist.
That's right. Okay. So now my objection was that there are people who get classified as atheist on this position, who I just think it's not so much that we classify an agnostic as an atheist on this view. It's the type of agnostic that we classify. So this green line on here in all of these diagrams represents my position on the general claim some God exists, which is to say that I'm doubtful about it. Right? I'm not completely confident that no gods exist. I mean, if we're talking about specific God, I think so this represents the high watermark for me for deity claims. So I no doubt this would be way down somewhere around here if we were talking about specific God concepts that I find to be less plausible. So, for instance, I think that the specific claims of, in the Bible and Christianity in particular, these kind of historical claims of miracle working, resurrection and such are enough for me to find that the whole belief system to be inherently dubious, very dubious, right? So I put that kind of Christian God claim down around here somewhere, along with the Norse gods and the whatever, and they all seem to me to be in very similar situation of like very, very likely to not be true. On the other hand, I don't know how to evaluate a much more esoteric claim about some kind of deity that leaves no trace of himself behind, just creates the universe and then remains forever inaccessible or something. I don't know how we could rule that out definitively. So I feel like nothing could count for or against it really. So I'm sitting somewhere along this part only because there's that type of God claim on the table.
So would it be fair, like your position, if we're using the card example, you have the equal amount of red and black cards. Your position would be that because of your experiences, for a fact it's like 5 red cards removed from the deck. That's what pushes you. Even so, now you're still in the position where where it's not belief, but it just seems less likely. It's not that you're saying it's true, but it's just less likely.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, even stripping away all of the dubious historical claims and sort of claims of personal interest in human welfare and stuff, all those things that make personal God claims seem rather dubious. Even if you strip all of that away and just have a kind of first cause, I feel like that's still probably less likely than some other thing being true that we just don't know about now. So yeah, I'm even then I'm skeptical, but yeah, I'm somewhat open-minded. I also feel like I don't have any good reason to feel confident in any direction over that type of profound metaphysical question. Like, it could be true that there's a first cause thing, that some kind of deist God, that could be true, it seems to me, and we'd have no way of knowing one way or the other. So how could you be particularly confident? It's just, I reckon it probably isn't. On balance, it probably isn't.
It's almost your confidence seems to be attached to your ability to evaluate the claim in a meaningful way. Because, like when you said about a deist God, you kind of just said that since you're really not able to evaluate it, but you can see that it could be possible, then that's what kind of leads you to a little bit less than the 0.5.
Yeah.
But that's so your belief is really attached to whether you're actually able to evaluate the claim as false. You more or less have to prove to yourself that this couldn't happen for you to believe that it really couldn't happen. Did I just confuse you, or did I just?
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. That's fairly accurate. So what I want to do now is imagine someone who's like the mirror image of me, right? So instead of the green line being just to the left of this middle bit, imagine this green line just to the right, but an equal amount, right? So it's roughly here where the cursor is now. So if that was the case, then what we're saying is that there's someone who feels like I do, that very difficult to evaluate what the nature of the universe is like at this fundamental level. Is there a real cause or not? Blah blah blah. Those things are very difficult to get your head around, and you can't feel confident one way or the other. But on balance, when push comes to shove, they think it's probably more likely than not that some kind of God exists, right? That probably does, right? Not very much, but probably does. Right, see, that person, it seems to me, leans in favor of theism, right? Thinks that the theist proposition is probably true, but just not very much, right? They're not enough to quantify as having a belief that it's true, right? But then on your picture, that person counts as an atheist. Now, I think that that's weird, right? That's my objection, is that I think pre-theoretically, if you ask someone, do you believe that, sort of, what's your view about whether God exists or not? And they say, well, on balance, I think he probably does. Some kind of God probably does exist, but it's probably more likely true, that proposition that some God exists. It's probably more likely to be true than false. But I'm hesitant to assign that I'm very confident about it. Right? I'm not confident about it. I just think that it's probably true. Right? Calling that person an atheist seems wrong to me. Right?
No, I agree, but I would just want to clarify. If I ask that person, well, do you believe that God exists? And they say it's likely, but they don't affirm that with a yes, then they would be the polar opposite of you, where they haven't affirmed a theistic claim, but they have assessed that it is more likely that it's true.
Yeah, they don't say they believe that any God exists, but they think that it's more likely that a God exists than not.
Yes. So yeah, I agree with you, because I do think that would the term atheist in that context would not properly identify what that person is in this context. Yes, I agree with you.
Yeah, so we can call this person the hesitant believer, right? The cautious believer, someone who doesn't, has a degree of belief, but not enough to come out and say it. The shy believer, something like that. Someone who's not got enough confidence in their belief to come out as a believer. They don't feel like that would be representing their view correctly, to say, I believe that some God exists. They're just the sort of person who, like, when push comes to shove, maybe on their deathbed, they end up offering a prayer or something like that, right? They basically do think that it's more likely than not. But that shy person, whatever we want to call them, and I think we probably all know people like this, right? There's probably a lot of people in this boat. It's probably like a bell curve, and there's probably more people towards the center of this diagram than there are on either extreme. And so it seems weird to misclassify what's quite a lot of people as atheists when they have some positive degree of belief that some God exists. So
Yes.
to me, that stands out as an objection against this claim, which isn't along the lines of those previous ones that you were being given before, which is, you're not giving out enough information or something. It's just that it misclassifies a large group of people who straightforwardly are not atheists. At least, I mean, they are if this definition is right. But we have, without thinking about any definitions, I think we can just tell. If you just describe someone who's a bit like that, and then say, well, that person's an atheist, I think that we just all sort of wonder whether that was right. We would all think that that's basically you just using the word wrong or something, right? It just doesn't fit with our practice of using.
Oh yeah, no, I definitely agree. It's difficult because the way that I think that's presented here is that hard line between yes, theism, everything else is atheism, doesn't work for the person, like you're saying, who honestly believes that it's more likely, because that person wouldn't be getting the definition that we use for atheist as someone who does not believe that God exists may not fit that, will not work for this particular person, even though technically it's a lot of times it's a difference between a technical definition and a working definition. So not a working definition, something that actually describes the event.
Mm. So I mean, look, it's not a knockdown objection. There are no knockdown objections in this area. It's just if you advocate for a particular definition, then you have to kind of agree with the consequences that come with it, and this is an awkward consequence, right? So
yes, it's a very bad consequence.
And let's just also reflect on, well, what's the purpose behind the change? I mean, well, it's clear that if somebody says something to you like, well, let's take a step back, right? So there's two types of beliefs that we can have, right? There's beliefs that have a justification. There's rational beliefs, and then there's irrational beliefs, unjustified beliefs, right? And well, sometimes we might think that we've got a justification for a belief, but the
For everybody who's leaving the side chat, Alex just dropped out. He's having some problems with his connection, so he's waiting for him to come back. Alex, Alex just dropped. He'll be right back.
So yeah, it looks like I dropped out again.
You're back. Can you hear me?
This is the worst hangout ever.
No. This is actually really good, dude. You know, I feel like I'm starting to get it now. So I just was like, damn, I hope he gets back in. Can you hear me well? Because my mic was acting up.
I can hear you perfectly. Yeah, I don't know how long I was off before. I was obviously on in the middle of just talking.
I literally typed the last word you said. You said, hold on. You said justification of belief, and that was it. You were gone.
So I was trying to. Did I explain what I thought was the difference between two different types of justification? Right.
No, you were about to go into that. Just
okay, right.
After that.
Christ. Okay, so so you could have. I'm going to open up the room in a minute, but let's see. So I could have a belief, right? So I could believe something, and so we want to distinguish between like rationally held beliefs and irrationally held beliefs, right? So, and take it that part of doing that is talking about the types of justifications that we have for those beliefs. So if I say that I believe that no gods exist, and my reason for holding that belief, I might say to you, is that I just flipped a coin and it landed heads, right? Well, we'd say that although I have a reason in this case, what I don't have is a justification, right? There's no the coin landing heads is kind of independent of the proposition being true. It's unrelated, right? So there's no, although it's what caused me to have that belief, say, it doesn't provide any reason for thinking that the belief is true, right? So we would say that although I have a reason in that case, I don't have a justification. At the other end of the scale, what we might say is my reason for thinking that no gods exist is because, let's say, I've got some a priori deductive proof that no gods could exist, and I say that, you know, I don't believe, I believe that no gods exist, and here's my proof that the proposition is true, that no gods exist, right? So obviously that counts as a reason, and I think everyone would agree that that also counts as a justification, right? It proves that the thing is true. So justification can be weaker than a proof. So I might say something like, look, the historical facts that go along with Christianity, without which it would be false, and the central kind of theistic claim would be false. Those historical facts about resurrection and walking on water and stuff like those things are very weakly supported by the evidence. It's more likely that those things are false than that they're true, right? Because, you know, there's good reasons to doubt miracle claims. Well, I mean, that doesn't prove that the thing is false, right? It doesn't prove that no gods exist. But what it does is clearly distinguishes my belief from one that was randomly generated by flipping a coin, right? The justifications I have are related to the proposition in question, right? They're reasons for thinking the proposition that no gods exist is true.
Can I ask you one question about so reading through the blog post, the one earlier, this is the same one that you sent me to read. At the end of it, you define yourself as an agnostic atheist, and I wanted to just understand why do you think that definition best fits your beliefs?
Okay, so so let's be precise about it. So what I'm saying is that when the proposition is some, so I'm taking it that the difference between a theist and an atheist, or at least the kind of the proposition in question is some God exists. So it doesn't matter which God, any God, right? So on that claim, then I would say that I count as well. I think I give 9 different tables, and I think it's split pretty much evenly. I'm either an agnostic, an atheist, or an agnostic atheist, right? So what that means is I either count as someone. So my degree of belief is the same in each case, right? It's hovering somewhere to the left of 0.5 on that specific proposition, because I don't see that I can be very confident about it, but I feel like it's probably not true, right? That could be any kind of God. So no, look, the reason that if you think that it's very unlikely that the Christian idea of God is true, let's say that you give that a 2% chance or something, and you also give, I don't know, say the Roman gods, you give them a 2% chance, and I don't know, the Islamic God, you give that 2% chance as well. And say that was all the gods that there were, well then even though each of those you only give a 2% credence to, your credence that some God exists should be the sum of those, right? So it's got to be 2 plus 2 plus 2, so I give 6% credence to the proposition that some God exists, right? Because it's the sum of the probabilities of each of the different ways that that proposition could be true. So you kind of mathematically, you can't have, you basically have to have a stronger degree of belief that some gods exist than that one particular God exists. But you can't be more confident that the Christian God exists than in the proposition that some God exists, right? Some God exists has got to be the most, it's got to be the proposition that you're more confident about than any individual God claim to start with. So that, and that seems to me it's the high watermark, right? I'm not going to get any more confident about any God claims than that claim.
Well, Alex, no, I everything you said makes perfect sense. But this is where I think I'm just a little confused with this point. As we were just talking about, someone who doesn't believe a God exists but believes it's more likely that a God exists. The term atheism, the way just saying it's a lack of belief, doesn't really explain their viewpoint. And I think because it leaves that out. And I also think someone who's in your position, the term, if I use atheism to say a person who believes that God does not exist wouldn't represent your viewpoint either. That would actually be wrong in that sense. So both those umbrella terms wouldn't represent your viewpoint, just like saying a lack of belief wouldn't represent the person who is confident, has a higher degree of confidence that the proposition could be true. So it seems that the best way to describe those two positions would be someone who could be an agnostic theist, an agnostic atheist, and then theist and on the end, because that those 4 terms would be able to then properly identify each person who we're talking about and not leave any, so if somebody says that I'm an agnostic theist, then I definitively know that you hold some belief in the proposition that God exists, but you're saying, well, but I just don't know it, or my degree of confidence is a lot less than someone who says, yes, I believe God exists. And similarly, in your position, where you're saying we're at the end of the diagram, that you're an agnostic atheist, signifies that your confidence in the claim that no gods, that in other words, you're not claiming that you believe no gods exist, but you're saying that you have a confidence level based on your own experiences that it's less likely for a God to exist than it is for God to exist.
Yeah.
Would that be a fair summary of what your blog post is really try to identify?
Yeah.
The best way to identify all these different positions in the fewest sort of terms.
Yeah. So I think here I've drawn out all 9 of the different positions that I went through in the post. So I mean, in the first one, look, atheism just means someone who believes that no gods exist, or atheist is just someone who believes that no gods exist. A theist is someone who believes that some gods exist, and then there's this patch in the middle that doesn't get classified either way. And the second view, atheist is someone whose degree of belief is anywhere less than 0.5, and a theist is anyone whose degree of belief is anywhere higher than 0.5. right? That's well, so this, I suppose you could call this first view hard atheism over here, and then this third view is the lack theist view, where an atheist is anyone who doesn't believe positively that God exists. This view in the middle, I'm not sure has really a name in contemporary jargon, but it seems like it should be, and in some sense it's the most simple view, but anyway. So there's a view, moving on a little bit, so in here it's just the same as view one, right? But what we're doing is classifying the bit in the middle as agnosticism, right? So an agnostic is just someone who doesn't believe in either direction. And then view 2.1 is just view 1.1, but with the agnostic brought into the picture as well. So where I would sit on this one is here, and because I'm in both the atheist box and in the agnostic box, I count as an agnostic atheist. Whereas on this one, I'm in the agnostic box, but I'm not in the atheist box, so I count as an agnostic on this one. And then, so if you keep running down, and like these other ones are just, well, the last three is just someone where agnosticism is defined in terms of knowledge, someone who doesn't believe in either direction, right? So on this view, I'm an agnostic and not an atheist. On this one, I'm an agnostic 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 atheist. On this, I'm an agnostic. On this, I'm an atheist. On this, I'm an atheist. And on this, I'm not classified. So, like,
No, I get it. Yeah.
the answer to the question of like which type of, which label I come under is completely dependent on what you mean by the label. Right? I mean, so I think your view in particular is probably this very last one, right? So at least an atheist is anyone who doesn't have a positive belief claim, and agnosticism is defined in terms of knowledge instead of belief, right? And so on this view, I count as an agnostic atheist. And so also does our friend, that shy theist before, he counts as an agnostic atheist on this view, even though it seems to me he should be better classified as an agnostic theist. I mean, that just seems like no argument for that, just my intuition tells me that they should be classified like that.
So let's say, for instance, so even on these charts, there seems to be no true agnostic. The true agnostic would be someone who's just a 0.5, where they have no information either way. Like how that person would because that person would you, like, even in the best scenario, can someone be put on the scale at just a 0.5 and say, I am just agnostic? I don't believe either side is more likely.
Well, I think it's kind of true, but it could be the case, right? It could be. You've got to think about, like, what's the probability that you're at that exact point? And in some sense, the probability is zero, right? Because we're talking about a real number line here, right? There's an infinite number of points along this line that you could be at, and the chances that you'd be exactly at any one of them is like infinite points to one. Like, that ratio doesn't really work. So, like, it's like if you were throwing a dart at a dartboard that had infinite points along it, you'd never hit the center if that was just a single point.
Of course,
I just take this view that, like, people's degrees of belief change very often, and they fluctuate all over the place. And the idea that you've got some degree of belief that's fixed enough at exactly 0.5 for that to count as a position on anything, I just fail to believe them.
Let me see if I can qualify the number.
Okay.
Okay, all right, you're back. No, what you said was brilliant, and now I do understand. And actually I feel like I have a fuller understanding of it. But I just the only question I really want to ask at the end is that because it seems like the best way to kind of just identify these positions is one, if you are an agnostic, either you have to get the label of theism and atheism to attach it to it, so we can actually accurately define what your belief really is, versus just saying I'm agnostic. And it seems like, because agnostic, somebody who is literally agnostic would be the 0.5, which would be impossible, because you, like you said, you're just throwing a dart on the screen and you can't land on that exact point, which is probably the probability of that was very, 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 very unlikely. The opposite side of that, so everyone's going to fall into a degree of either agnostic theism, agnostic atheism, or atheism and theism, based on more or less all of those gradations of between 0 and 1.
Yeah.
Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, that's right. It's not mathematically impossible, but I mean it's as close to being mathematically impossible as you can get. That you don't sit at any one exact number on that line, just because it's a real number line. So there's it's just not going to happen.
Well, look, listen, I stand corrected. I now I do understand. I do think defining atheism solely as the rejection of a theistic claim, you do lose the ability to you do lose that one subset, and you misclassify a lot of people who believe it's more likely. I agree with that 100%. But then I also think too that as a consequence of that, by defining yourself as just an agnostic, also gives you that same ambiguity. It doesn't know, because then you're saying that you're just a 0.5, which is less than likely true. The probability of that is highly, highly unlikely. You have to actually either decide that the proposition is more likely or less likely, but out of that 0.5, you can't just say I'm a 0.5. Would that be a fair assessment of what we've talked about?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's right. So you just have to excuse me for one moment because my dog's going a bit mental and she needs her dinner. So I'm just going to pour out some dinner for her and then I'll be right back. But I've put the.
Do you want me to add some people in, or?
Yeah, you go for it. Yeah.
All right, cool. Because some people have been asking for that. I'll get to that point. Hey, what's going on, Carrie? Sorry, I was adding people to the chat. I didn't see you come in. What's up, man? Just for the people in the side chat, I don't think this was a debate. It was I was trying to understand. The reason why we're having a discussion is because there was some confusion about, well, on my end, about whether atheism could just be defined as a lack of belief. And even though it does seem logically coherent, the problem was it doesn't really identify a whole large group subset of people who believe it's more likely, but that a God exists, but don't accept the proposition that a God exists. And I do agree with that. And then we kind of came to the conclusion that the best way to identify people in these theological discussions seems to be either they'll be an agnostic theist or theist or atheist, because it best describes all points of view on the scale from 0 being no knowledge, no belief, to 1 where you have absolute knowledge that this thing exists. So that's kind of where we concluded. And then the claim someone says that they are just plainly agnostic, which is the 0.5 on the scale. There's a high probability that you weren't, because you've had some experience. you have some experience of why you believe the claim or don't believe the claim. So it's really unlikely that somebody's just going to be a pure agnostic. They're either going to be agnostic leaning toward the atheist or agnostic leaning toward the theist. So I hope I explained that well.
Yeah, so I think like the main thing that should matter is if you do have a position one way or the other on the claim, like if you hold a belief that say if we restrict ourselves to just thinking about, say, Christianity for the sake of argument, or one version of Christianity, whatever, you can have reasons for thinking that Christianity is false, and they can be justified or not. And simply saying that you're an atheist doesn't mean that you, for some reason, don't need to give reasons for the beliefs that you actually have. I mean, it seems to me there's something kind of weird about classifying a whole group of people who hold beliefs and classifying them in such a way that they don't have to explain the beliefs that they hold. I find something kind of strange about that, but
yeah, I agree with you 110%. You know, it's interesting because I think when you look at something like the atheist experience, Matt Dillahunty, and that's the one point I disagree with Matt Dillahunty about, because he always says that, well, I don't have to put forth why I disbelieve your claim. But I think in a legal context, when you're talking about law, yes, that's the way, because somebody's presenting a position, and you have to prove your position. I don't have to disprove your position. But I think when you're having these discussions in the philosophical context, you know, if I ask you what you believe and you say no, and then I don't tell you why I don't believe it, then we can't really have a discussion. It's like you're saying, it makes no sense. Why would we? Why are we having a conversation if you're not telling me why you don't believe the proposition? You know, you could say I just don't have any evidence, and that may be good enough to have a discussion. But if I just say I don't believe and walk away, then it's meaningless almost to even continue on the conversation.
Yeah.
Isn't part of the problem the fact that you're using an umbrella term to start the conversation and then asking about specifics? I mean, that creates the problem from my point of view immediately right off the bat.
But so if somebody says, I mean, God is an umbrella term already, right? So I mean,
Yes.
The idea that we would have a discourse completely free of umbrella terms, and then along came the person redefining atheism and introduced the idea of umbrella terms where we didn't have any before, is wrong, right? We've already got umbrella terms. And as I said earlier, I mean, so the question, does God exist, is already an umbrella term. So which one do you mean? Blah, blah, blah. It leads to that further clarifying question anyway. But then also there are other positions on the table, like agnostic, where that's an umbrella term too, right? Because there's a hard agnostic who says that you can't know, and then there's a soft agnostic who says that they just happen to not know. So if someone says that they're an agnostic, then you should be like complaining just as much. Well, that's just an umbrella term. You haven't told me if you're a hard agnostic or a soft agnostic. And really what happens with these things is that everybody's very nuanced, well, at least when they start thinking about things properly. There'll always be further subdivisions and wrinkles and subtleties to it.
Wait, are you saying that someone who uses an umbrella term to start the conversation would not be happy with being replied to with an umbrella term?
So how do you mean?
God is an umbrella term. Agnostic is an umbrella term. If you're asking an umbrella question with like unspecified components, why would an umbrella response in any way be inappropriate?
Why would it be inappropriate?
Right. I mean, you haven't specified anything, so why look for a specified response?
Well, I think Alex, I'm not Alex, Carrie. So in the term of, let's say, for instance, if I say, does God exist? And I say, I mean, do you believe God exists? And you say, I do not believe God exists. You're just responding to the umbrella term, does God exist? And if someone says, well, I don't know, what type of person you are, what do you mean when you say, I don't believe God exists? Now you're asking me for a specific, but your initial question was about the umbrella, correct?
Correct. Yeah. And as long as it's about the umbrellas, there are certain generalities that you could engage in. But I don't know if being upset that someone says it's just not something you can know is somehow a problem per se. as a response to an umbrella question.
I'm not sure I'm really getting it. So I thought that the point was like, look, there's this objection to atheism being defined as the lack of belief. And the objection is, if you say that you're an atheist, then you still haven't adequately specified what your position is, because it's an umbrella term. You haven't said which of the things that the umbrella covers is your view, right? And that's the objection, right?
I suppose. I mean, I'm not sure why you'd object to that. Again, unless you're asking something specifically concerning a specific theistic position, then just saying you don't hold any, how is that a bad answer?
Yes, it carries like how I was explaining it earlier, that the question, if you're asking one question but looking for a different answer, you're asking a general question but looking for a specific answer. And I think he's correct when he says that if I answer the general question in a general way, then that should be sufficient to say that question is answered. But if you want to know some more specifics about it, then the question should be, what's your theological position versus do you believe in a God? Does that make sense?
That's kind of what I'm talking about, yeah.
Yeah, so it's a general question in the first place, and so a general answer seems to be like okay for that purpose, right? And I don't think anyone's really going to object to that. If someone just asks you a general question, do you possess a positive belief that a God exists? You can say no, and that's fine. That's not objectionable. What seems to be objectionable is if someone says to you, hey, there's all these categories like theist, agnostic, atheist, which one are you in? And you say that you're an atheist. That if what you mean is that if your position is actually that God doesn't exist, right? That the proposition that God exists is false. But what you're doing is including yourself in a group that covers people who have a different view, which is that they don't possess that positive belief. What you're doing is sort of hiding amongst other people in a certain way. When someone asks you what your position is, and you say atheist to mean a bigger group than the one that adequately reflects your view, that there's something kind of misleading about that. So it's not just that yes, if someone asks you a general question, you can give them a general answer. But I suppose the thought is that if you have a specific view, but you deliberately choose to describe that in an umbrella term that's less specific than what your view is, then especially if the purpose of doing that is to avoid difficult questions or something, reduce your burden, make life easier in a debate or something. If that's the only reason you're doing it, it does seem to be a kind of faux pas or something. It's like it's kind of rude or it's improper to do that. It's not a logical mistake, but it's like, I don't know, if you ask someone, do you believe that no gods exist? And they say no. Okay, they are answering your question properly, but if they defined that the no answer there to be the definition of theist is just someone who doesn't believe that no gods exist, then it just seems like they're hiding amongst the agnostics as well. Like the agnostics now count as theists because they're people who lack the belief that no gods exist. And
well, you're not necessarily hiding if you're talking about an umbrella term. And if someone thinks atheist is something specific and someone else thinks it's an umbrella term, you're never going to get anywhere until you've actually fixed your identity for what you're calling atheist.
Yeah, and I also must object to the point of the person who is asking the question. I think it's on them to ask a question that's appropriate for the response that they want. If they're going to ask a question that can be answered plainly and say no or yes, and then say, well, you're hiding within, because we're almost getting to the point where we're saying, if I ask you a general question and you give me a general response, but your intent is to deceive me, to hide within the larger group, that's your fault. But if I ask you a question and you give me an answer to answer that question, I can't really gauge your intent. If I was to say something like, what's your theological position? And you say atheist, and you're using atheist to include all these other terms, I think you're right. I think that would be dishonest. But I think if you ask me, do I believe in God? And I say atheist in the sense of I just don't, or I don't accept your position. I think that's a different. I think that's appropriate because the the burden will be on the person who's asking the question to ask the correct question to get the answer they want.
I agree. I don't think you could try talking about someone's intent and consider it a justified claim of any kind. I mean, how would you know someone's intent? You can only deal with what they say.
Yeah, this is why I like the term. I believe we live in a godless cosmos. I think that explains quite a bit in a very short amount of time, without dealing with the common words used like atheist, theist, agnostic.
Yeah, it's easy enough to explain the view. Right? It's not a very particularly complicated view, and you think that no gods exist. If you think that's true, but we need a label for that.
Did you see any of my posts on this already, Alex?
No, I can't say that.
I am a former minister, so I have a significant background in theology.
Right.
And when you're talking about gods, you're describing the whole deist theism delineation. So there are certain statements that are made that go along the lines of, if God is an umbrella term, you're dealing in the area of deism. Because at some point you can be talking about a God that it consists of like everything in the universe is God. And all that was required was that God create the universe. At that point, he's removed from the conversation, and that's the end of deism. If you then assume that God has a personal nature and is interacting with the universe personally on any level, that's where the theism starts. So I've always, from my point of view, when someone said that they were an atheist, I never once thought that didn't mean that they didn't reject all gods. It just meant that they didn't hold a theistic position to the God question. And if they were then trying to claim that they were pantheist, that God is everywhere, God is all things, in theology, I don't care, because there's nothing I can do unless you agree that there's a personal God there. And then, of course, you kick into the explanation about why you should care about a personal God. So I'm not sure if it's helpful to ignore the deist component of the question itself. Do people not use the term atheist in any form that you know of?
I've literally never heard the phrase atheist before.
Well, deism is a thing. And so if you're using the same structure of theism, atheism, or non and whatever, then by default, there is a non-deist position. There's like, you believe that God is there, or you don't hold the belief that God is there.
Yeah.
And that just, but because deism is by itself relaying so little information, the atheist position also reveals almost less information. And it is only useful combined with some sort of theistic worldview, to the point where even as a minister, if you came to me and said you were a deist, I wouldn't waste my time with you, because I would then have to try to figure out some way of making you care that God was a personal being. So I understand why it doesn't get used in conversations, because it is almost useless in describing anything except for the idea of whether or not you believe in any kind of God. In which case, it's very useful because it's a binary term, yes or no.
So I think you can be a deist and not be a theist, right?
Yes. Well, specifically, a deist believes that the universe either is God or that God is a person, but he no longer concerns himself with the functioning of the universe after its creation.
Yeah, okay, and I could take it that you can be a theist and not be a deist as well, right?
No, you cannot. Because the moment you claim that you are a theist, you are claiming that not only is God real, but he is interacting and you know how. And your dogma, your theology is now based off of specifically how he's interacting. The forgiveness of sins, all that stuff. That is where the theism kicks in. So by talking on the theism level, you're talking about different dogmas. By saying you're an atheist, sorry, go ahead.
Well, look, if you say, like, my view of God is that he exists, but he doesn't interact in the world in any way, then you're a deist.
In theology, you're a deist, yes.
Yeah, and so if you say, well, my view is that God exists, but he does interact in the world in some way, then you're not a deist, because you're denying one of the two claims about deism. One of the claims is God exists, the other one is that he doesn't interact, and you're denying that second claim. So it doesn't seem to me that theism is a subset of deism. They're just, both of them are subsets of people who believe in a God. But deism...
Run that by me again.
Okay, so look, deism is it's two claims, right? First one is that some God exists.
Right.
And the second one is that God doesn't interact in the world in any way.
Correct.
Okay. And then a theist is someone who accepts one of those but denies the other one. Right? So they accept that a God exists, but they deny that God doesn't interact in the world in any way. Right?
No, his point, the point of it is, if he exists, existence must contain some facet of how you can justify that he exists. It's not its own thing. If you have to be able to show that his existence is affecting the world in some way. It's why the term is used personal God at that point. It's because you're describing how and the why and the where of his existence.
Can I ask you just a point of clarification? If a theist, the claim of a theist is, I believe a God exists.
No.
And the claim of a deist is they also believe a God exists, but that God doesn't interact in the world. Then it almost seems that a deist is a subset of theism, but you said no, Harry.
Well, the first thing you got to establish is whether or not a God is part of the equation at all. And that's
that was a view that was put forth by Matt Dillahunty believes that you start with theism and then breaks down to deism and something else. I don't agree with it, but
in theology, that's not how it's expressed. So I mean,
I agree. I think it's not expressed. I was just trying to flow. It seemed like that's what you guys had said, so I was like, well, hold on, I think that may not be.
Yeah, I don't particularly like that way either. It's fine if he wants to go that way, fine, as long as he's going to have to explain it every time he brings it up. But if that's where he wants to go with, that's okay. Dillahunty I'm referring to, of course.
Well, he may have had a reason for viewing that way, and if it was for a specific argument, again, all that's required at the beginning of the argument is that everybody agree on the terms being used, and then you can make whatever point it is you're trying to make. But if you're talking about the set of beliefs that you hold about that God, you're no longer debating his existence. You're debating his nature.
Yeah.
So let me try this again. So deism, so start off with it seemed to me what you were saying about theism is that, so it's two claims, right? One is that God exists, and the second one is that, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you said something along the lines of, and there's some way of finding out about him, right? He's not completely inaccessible, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the primary components of theism, or different theologies, whatever it is that the God that you're talking about cares enough about you to relay information to you in some way. Even if it is just by divine revelation, he's still interacting with you.
Okay, good. So, I mean, well, okay, so God exists and he cares enough about you to interact with you in some way. Okay, and so if that's the definition of theism, then deism is the claim that God exists, but he doesn't care enough about you to interact with you in some way. Right? So
yes.
However you want to, I don't mind what you put in as that criteria, but it's clearly a criteria that's true on theism and false on deism. I was calling it interacting with the universe. You're calling it caring enough about people so that we can interact with him. Well, however you cash it out, it doesn't make any difference.
The official label, if you want to use it, is personal.
Okay, so on theism, God exists and is personal, and on deism, God exists and is not personal, right? And if that's the case, then deism is not a subset of theism, right? They're mutually exclusive. That you can't, deism and theism can't both be true. So, I mean, it just seems to me that is enough to, I mean, if that's what the meanings of the words are.
I'm sorry, Alex, if I may throw a quick wrench into it just for the fun of it. What if someone believed there was one God that was impersonal, another one that was personal? How would you define that person?
Well, if he believes in multiple gods, then he believes in multiple gods.
Specifically, one's follows it would be a deist definition, the other would be a theistic one. How would that work? Do we have to make up a whole new word for explaining that person?
No,
Yeah,
as long as he holds to the belief that one of those gods interacts, then he's a theist.
But what about the one that's a deist?
I think technically,
No, he is still the same person with both of those ideas. So he could believe there's a deist God out there, but because he holds that there's a theist God out there, he's a theist.
But isn't he a deist also?
Yes.
So so there's this view called Neoplatonism, and it's by this guy called Plotinus, who was like a 3rd century guy. I guess he was Greek or Turkish or something, but it's kind of a philosopher whose view is something, it's a very strange view, but it's something along the lines of God exists, but in such a way, he's kind of a deist, right? You can't really say anything about this God that exists, right? This supreme being that exists is like, you know, he's like perfect in every way, of course, but like he doesn't have he doesn't change in any way whatsoever. It doesn't interact, can't interact with anything in any way whatsoever.
Yes, that's a deist position.
So, but on this view, there's also a kind of 2nd level God. Actually, there's kind of several layers of God, right? So there's a kind of demiurge who does the stuff that God needs to do in order to get stuff done, right? So this is
the demiurge considered part of the universe.
Sorry?
Is the demiurge considered part of the universe?
Kind of. The demiurge is the thing that makes the physical reality that we live in. So if that's what you mean by universe, he's not part of the universe, but he's the thing that makes the universe. And he has to do that because the supreme God can't really do anything, right? He just is the ground.
If he's not part of the universe, then it doesn't really matter if the other God is interacting with the demiurge. He's that interaction is taking outside the realm of anything that we can interact with. It's not until there is some interaction on the personal level that it becomes a theistic concern.
Well, I mean, so this demiurge, it doesn't really matter about the details of Neoplatonism, right? But it may as well be that the demiurge can intervene in the course of events as well, right? In such a way that we could figure out that they exist.
And the moment he does, it would be a theistic position.
Well, yeah, but the point is that there's 2 gods, right? The demiurge plays the role of theist in a sense, you know, this sort of theistic kind of notion of God, creates the physical world, intervenes to perform miracles and stuff. But on the other hand, there's this deist God who really is the ground of everything, but you can't interact with him in any way, and he's completely inaccessible. So, I mean, I was just saying that, you know, that there actually is a view that's a bit similar to what JD was just proposing, and that's Neoplatonism actually is a view quite similar to that.
But wouldn't that be a problem of identity then? You're identifying someone who acts in every way as though the God of any other theism would act. So at what point are you no longer talking about a God?
Oh, so you mean like a functionally theists?
Why call it a demiurge if it does everything that a normal God would do? Except, of course, creation of the universe.
Well, it does create the physical universe, but its being is dependent on the actual God, the sort of more supreme God. And I mean, I forget the detail of the arguments, right? It's not something I ever knew particularly well, but there are supposedly rational reasons for thinking that there needs to be this utterly impersonal metaphysical ground for everything. But then again, there's also very good reasons for thinking that there needs to be some slightly more hands-on God that actually does stuff in specific things. And they get around that problem of having a completely timeless thing and a sort of semi-temporal thing by just having, you know, a second level of God who does
I'll have to look into Neoplatonism, because if there's an argument for why there has to be an existence of a deist God, that's not insignificant.
Yeah, you probably won't like the arguments, but yeah, I can probably send you something that would be interesting.
That would be awesome. Thank you.
So anyway, look, I don't know. I don't want to. I don't know how long we want to go on for. We've been for an hour and 45, but I'm quite happy to just open up the conversation, and I might start cooking. So I don't know if anyone else has got stuff they want to say.
Well, to the distinction between, you know, whether or not theism is a subset of deism or deism is a subset of theism, I don't really think that's an important question, or how whether it makes sense to be an atheist or not. The idea with being a theist is that you, or an atheist, is that you're rejecting the notion of a God. You believe that no gods exist, and within that, does that necessarily mean that you're rejecting now deistic claims of God as well, or whatever? Honestly, it doesn't matter. Deistic claims of God are irrelevant. They're inconsequential to day-to-day life. The moment that you say that there's something that is impersonal, that has no interactions with you on any type of scale or whatever, it becomes an inconsequential issue to hold a belief or not. It's really not relevant in any way. So,
Correct.
so that's why we make the distinction for, even with atheists, you're rejecting the theistic claim, that the theistic concept of God doesn't exist, because that one has more relevance to your interactions on a day-to-day basis, because you're rejecting something that should be tangible, that should be measurable, that in a way. So like any theistic claim has to do with something that's interacting with reality. You're saying that that's not true. Okay. And now a deistic claim, they're saying, well, this thing doesn't interact with reality. Regardless of what your opinion on this is like, who cares? That's why we make no distinction between atheist positions or anything like that. That's why the term, deist is also so vague, in the sense that it could refer to, the universe as God, or could refer to, like Spinoza's God, for example, which most would even put as not really in the God category.
Well, that's the thing, is that if you do hold a deist position, you are essentially rejecting all forms of dogma. So that's why Spinoza's God is so useful, is because at that point in time, they didn't have the understanding that Darwin essentially provided, that it was possible to be like intellectually fulfilled in your perception of the universe because it could be explained by natural means. Spinoza's God was essentially the acknowledgement that everything appears as though there has to be at least a prime mover, but that's a perception thing. And once Darwin comes along, he provides the capacity to say, well, wait a minute, that's no longer a necessity. So you don't have to be rejecting dogma of any theism. You can reject the entire God concept directly. And that is kind of why I always thought it was important to have those ideas meshed out. Because if you are, for example, a pantheist, or one of the other non-Christian beliefs, there has to be some point of reference and contact for a beginning of a discussion. At least from my background as a minister, that was very important. I had to try to convince somebody that they needed to switch to the idea of a personal God. If they had a Spinoza's God, that wasn't so bad. You could work on that, but it was virtually useless without adding something to it.
Okay, I don't think Spinoza's God is necessarily the prime mover God. That's a different concept there. Yeah.
That's how he was defined for me. Let me look it up.
Yeah, the Spinoza's God is more kind of like the that everything is God, that the nature of reality itself is just aspects of this God. Right, Alex? Is that, yes.
That's right. Yeah. So pantheist, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess pantheism right there. But that's the thing, is like, so within the realm of deistic claims of God, there is they attach this label of God to it, but not in any type of recognizable form that we'd have from any type of theistic version of course, because within any type of theistic religions, these gods have to be personal. They take on human-like attributes, or we give them human-like attributes in the way that they interact. They make choices, they have feelings, their emotions, all these other things, memories, moods, whatever. The most theistic God claims are reflections of human nature, and with the deistic God claims, they're not. There's no requirement for them to be humanized in any way. They could simply say there's like that. With the deistic claim of God is that I can't remember what it is, but it's just like, why is there order rather than chaos? Well, because there has to be order is an aspect of this God. That's it. Like, he only has one aspect to his nature, and it's that he provides order to the universe. He's not personal. He doesn't feel, think, care about anything else. There, he's not personal in any way, in the sense that Not just in the sense that he doesn't interact with us, it's just that it's not even a person. It has no personhood. That they're just labeling this this force of order, and they're calling it a god. But really, that doesn't even meet the definition that most people would adhere to when describing what they mean by a god. And anything can fall as a technically a god, quotation marks, under a deistic claim.
Yes.
Which makes it completely vacuous. It makes it
Yes.
there's really no point in even. I mean, for people that hold on to these deistic views, that they believe that that this thing that they'll call God is the order or the nature of the universe or the fabric that holds reality together, or whatever. They use God as a placeholder. The term God as a placeholder. So again, most of the time when we have these discussions within these theological discussions on God, we have a pretty good idea of what we're talking about when we talk about God. Any claim with a deist on this, though, is that they're essentially using God as a placeholder at the time. So it's really hard to hold an atheist position because there's no kind of uniform answer or criteria of what necessarily makes this God at this point.
Well, that's part of the whole problem, is that if you don't even hold the belief that there's anything like a God, then that also is included in the umbrella term of atheist, and we are currently trying to figure out how to politely ask people to not use umbrella terms if you're looking for a specific answer.
But here's the thing: is that you can use anything. Like if there's something for yourself, at the end of the road where you hit the absolute bedrock of what you can know, and then everything beyond that is considered unknown. You can call that God and consider yourself a theist. A deist. So me and you, who might hold traditional atheistic views, can have the same beliefs about absolutely everything, except understanding that we get to this point of this bedrock where our ability to know beyond that is no longer, we can no longer pass that line. And then you can say, well, therefore, everything beyond that, I'm just going to label as God until we have a term for it. And you're going to call yourself a deist at this point in time.
But you would be justified in asking my justification for doing that.
No, it's just because it's just a label. It's a vacuous label that you apply to the unknown at that point in time. You don't need a justification for why you call that. You're defining this God into existence as everything that's unknown beyond a certain point. And like I said, we could have the same views and we can agree on absolutely everything. And what's our argument going to be at this point in time? Well, that's just you're using the wrong word to describe a concept that you don't know. It's a placeholder. That's all it is. You don't need a justification at that point in time, because all you're doing is just you're applying a label to it.
By your own definition, though, I was using a vacuous term, so I would have to acknowledge that on some level.
Yeah, and most deists do. So I mean, that's the point. Is that that's why the concepts of deism don't really come up too much within these discussions.
Except to the point of holding no belief at all in any gods. So you wouldn't even qualify as a deist. And if you then started saying that anything I don't know is a god, then no, I suppose you couldn't. I think the moment you did that, you are making some sort of statement that you have a justified reason for saying that everything you don't know is a god. I mean, that sounds so much like a loaded statement. How can that not be something you have to back up?
Well, because you don't need to, because you're defining just essentially everything that gets to that unknown point as a god. Now, remember, like I said, they use God as a placeholder. They use God as a term that's not universally accepted. It's completely different than what you'd use, that a theist would use a definition for, or even an atheist would use a definition for when they're making belief claims about why this God doesn't exist. So we have this concept in mind within the theistic realm of this, but within the deistic realm, we don't have this concept. Okay, so because of that, you essentially are defining God into existence at this point, and you're labeling everything past a certain point. So what burden do you have at that point in time, other than saying everything beyond this is this? For you to say that now they have to justify that, why do you label it that? They say, well, they label it that because that's just what they label the unknown. You're the one that's already putting in your traits or characteristics to this deistic notion of God without them actually doing it, because you're actually because for the reason that you're now going to be reverting back to a theistic point of view on this. Is what makes this a God? Well, what makes this a God is it's the placeholder. It's everything beyond that point.
So I think that actually explained it for me, because you were talking about if it doesn't actually have any characteristics, there's no fear of this belief I'm holding being the basis of any decision I make, because it contains no characteristics to base any decision on.
I don't think that's quite true, right? I mean, you could have a society which was split into two groups, right? Which is the people who claimed to have a belief in the deistic God, and people who didn't. And there might be grave consequences for not being part of the group that claimed to believe in a deistic God. So there could be consequences to believing. You might think it's the best thing you can do for your child is to bring them up in such a way as they believe in the deist God. Like why doesn't that count as a consequence for the way they live their lives? Based on
because there were a lot of judgment words in that particular sentence. I mean, you used the term best, so clearly you're comparing something, but you're talking about something that is not comparable to anything. So at that point, you're not.
They would.
Before you guys go, I'm gonna have to run because I've gotta take the kids to the picnic. First, I want to thank Alex. Hey man, I really appreciate you going through this. This was
no
really
trouble.
Inspirational. Thank you so much, and it's great to meet everybody. Great to meet you for the first time too, Gary. I appreciate the conversation. You guys have a great day. All right.
Cool. You take care. So let's go back to my example, right? So imagine there's this race of people, civilization somewhere, where they're split into two groups: the deist party and the non-deist party. It might be that the deist party is in power and brutally repress the non-deist party, so that the non-deist party people never get access to any good jobs or healthcare or blah blah blah, right? And so you might just say, it's better if I can bring up my child to be a natural deist enthusiast, because they're more likely to get jobs, good healthcare, blah blah blah. It's clearly better for their life interests if they were a deist. So I don't understand this claim that there could be no consequences to holding deist view. There clearly could be, right?
I think what they mean,
Well,
what I mean with that, where there's no consequence, is that baked into the notions of most theistic claims is a consequence for belief or not. Okay, so like that's to the God itself, and what ends up happening is because of this revelation or whatever, because this God does interact in such a way, people will invoke God's will upon others. So the consequence of not believing in a theistic religion is the will of the people that follow it, because they have this interaction with this God. Now, under a deistic claim like that, this God is not interacting with people at all. It's completely impersonal. So what motivations can people hold to that would punish those that did not share this notion? I mean, I think that's the tough one there. It's like, yeah, I guess you could have a society of people that are deistic, but what motivation, what for would they have against all the non-deistic people out there?
If they have any kind of dogma related to this God, it's not truly a deistic God anymore, because they would then at some point have to justify every action they've made based off of their act, off of this claim they've made.
Yeah, okay, but I still don't really see how any of that changes what I was saying. I mean, so it could be that the deistic tribe hate the non-deistic tribe for being different. It's not a dogma. It's not because the deist God told them to hate the non-deist tribe. They just hate them because they're not like they are. And everybody hates them. Everyone's tempted into viewing the other as strange and different and to be not trusted, right? That's natural human way of thinking about things, unfortunately. That's how the right-wing press manages to survive.
But that's very basic. And you're talking about them disagreeing with someone else, not on just a basic, like, my hair's blonde, your hair's brown. You're talking about them hating someone else off of a concept that has no characteristics.
Yeah, I get what Alex is saying. Yeah, it makes sense. You're right. There would be consequences in that sense. I think when I say the term that is inconsequential, what I'm meaning is that if said God did exist, my belief in it is inconsequential to my day-to-day life, in reference to my relationship now with this God, because it doesn't have a relationship with me.
Yeah. The deist God is never going to punish you regardless of what you believe. I think that's what you're trying to say, and I think that's right. That's true.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah, that's true, even if there are consequences to believing in the deist God anyway, like I was talking about, with job prospects and such. So we've reached a point of agreement then.
I think so. I'm not actually entirely certain why there was such confusion on all of the various forms in the first place, because it seemed like the question was designed to cause confusion. The whole umbrella question being unsatisfactorily answered with an umbrella reply. And I was like, fine, if you don't want an umbrella reply, don't ask an umbrella question. Start doing the whole proper, give it an identity, give it qualities and characteristics, and then you can start talking about specific things. But a lot of the posts maybe have just been troll posts in which people are arguing that no, I say that you possess a burden of proof because I say this word has this claim inherent in its very nature. And you see a lot of posts like that, and I'm just baffled by them.
Yeah, so I think that the notion of burden of justification is, it's not something that it's not something where you say inherit it on the basis that you belong to a group of people. Like that's not actually something that gives you a burden of justification. So my being a member of the atheist community, if defined broadly enough to include me, doesn't mean that I either possess or lack any additional burden of justification for anything that I believe, right? So there's some kind of basic misunderstanding, it seems to me, that goes on in a lot of these discussions in chat rooms and online and stuff about well, I'm an atheist, so I don't have to present any justification for my beliefs, right? That's just fundamentally wrong, right? So first of all, it depends what somebody's just asked you. It depends what you've just said, right? So if you say no God exists, and then someone says, okay, well, what's your justification for that? You can't then say, well, I'm an atheist, I don't have to give you a justification, or you've just made a positive claim. But also, secondly, even if you don't ever say that claim out loud, if that's your belief anyway, it's either justified or it's not. If it's not justified, then it's an irrational belief, whether or not you say it out loud. And really, the important thought, the real thing that matters isn't what you say in a debate, it's what you actually think. Right? Is your belief justified? It might not be. You might hold the belief but not have a good reason for holding it.
True. But it could also be justification that is so trivially simple to almost be useless.
Sure, justification is something that's a scale as well, right? It's not just justified or not justified. But once you start having something that counts as a justification, there's better and worse justifications, right? But so it's a somewhat complicated. But the idea is that your need for a justification is not there. It's not generated by you saying something in a conversation. It's not generated by you, being described under a certain umbrella category. Your need for having a justification is there to distinguish your rational from irrational beliefs. And for an atheist, supposedly doesn't need to sort his beliefs into rational and irrational. It's just to abandon the kind of rationalistic enterprise of doing philosophy and investigating what you think and what the world is like, right? You still have to do that, even if you're an atheist. And it seems to me that's where something juvenile about this. I can just sidestep all of these difficult questions about what my reasons are for thinking the things that I do. I don't have to have that philosophical conversation because I am just going to use the label of atheism as a sort of scythe that cuts through all of the philosophy. And I think it's used by people who don't like philosophy, who find it, something that gets in the way of trumpeting how science explains everything or whatever. That they want, that's the message they want to say.
So should we be trying to promote the idea of people simply stating that they've heard no justified claim and that's why they're an atheist? I mean, that is as basic an explanation as one could provide, is that I have not been presented with a justifiable claim.
Well, I mean, that might be, I think you should only say that if that's what your actual position is. I mean, I wouldn't advocate anyone going around saying that unless that's what they actually thought. I mean, so for me, I wouldn't say that's my main argument, right? I mean, it's true, I don't find any of the, you know, these kind of proofs of God's existence. It's true that I don't find any of them persuasive. That's not my primary or let alone only reason. It's not like, oh, well, all you have to do is provide me with an unassailable a priori proof and then I'll change my mind, right? That's kind of absurd when you think about it, that it makes the burden too high. You know, my only reason for not believing is because someone hasn't literally proved it to me, right? That might be your reason. It seems like a weird epistemic standard. I think you're much more likely to say something like, you know, a battery of reasons that come to mind, but, you know, you think about this idea of, you know, you can trace the anthropomorphization of the idea of God, and it used to be this guy walking along, talking to people and stuff like that, and it just obviously sounds like a bunch of other myths that you don't believe in. And those types of things, they're not just, I just haven't seen good evidence. It's the evidence you've seen is of such a low standard that it makes you bracket that whole system with a bunch of flat. Those types of considerations, I'd be much more. I mean, I'm not telling anyone what to think, right? But if you do think that, if that describes your view, which seems to me it does describe a lot of atheists' views, then say that. You know, don't just say, well, you know, if only I'd been given.
The way you explained it is a very positive way of putting it, saying that the evidence I have been presented has failed to meet any criteria. But of course, the way I thought I was saying it could be seen as more of a lackluster way of explaining it, just that I haven't been presented with any justified, you know, evidence that convinces me one way or the other. So, but for myself, for example, I wouldn't necessarily be able to do that because I have this entire history of arguing against specific God claims. So I know that some of them are persuasive on certain levels, but I also can refute them on certain levels as well. So,
yeah, and I mean, like, I also, you know, going into my own view in particular, but like I don't really favor the idea that so what I'm trying to say is, I think to some extent I think this idea of a chain of justifications is somewhat misleading as an analogy, right? When you say I believe P and my justification for that is this other belief I have Q, and the reason I have for believing Q is this other belief I have R, whatever. I already find that way of thinking about things kind of misleading. So let's say, well, you ask me, why is it that I don't believe in God, right? I can choose from a range of things, right? So I tend to think of my belief that, say, the Christian God doesn't exist as a part of a kind of spider diagram. There's lots of different connected beliefs that I hold, and they mutually support one another, right? So I happen to believe that the historical evidence is very poor, and you know, it's tied to these historical facts being true, and if they're not true, then the religion is false. Right? It seems to me that, you know, it's very, very likely that those things were just exaggerations or made up or whatever, blah blah blah. I also happen to think that, you know, the proofs that people provide for God existing seem to be flawed, and some of the proofs that point in the other direction, like problem of evil and silence and stuff, I mean, those things make me believe, tend towards thinking that it's more likely that that type of God doesn't exist. All of these things, and many others, right? I mean, I have a general picture of the way that the world is, that though I don't claim to know exactly how it works, I do think that there isn't this kind of like personal being in the background of it, right? So it seems like it's much more mechanistic. I'm not saying that it's materialism is true, but it may well not be, right? But it just seems to me that whoever's driving it, whatever's driving it in the background, it's not a personal agent like me. It may be some kind of utterly alien thing. It might be some mindless, like, whatever. However it is, might be something I can't possibly imagine. It just doesn't seem like it's an agent like me. Right? And the idea that it would be strikes me as a kind of immature projection that people make because they want to understand the world, and they're projecting the only thing they do understand, which is themselves, onto it. I mean, all of those things combined together. I can't just say one, you know, this is the thing that supports my belief, right? In a way, I have an outlook, all of these things sort of mesh together. Not all of them very well, but some of them. And when you focus on a particular area, you kind of try and build a package that's as coherent as possible. And so to me, I find that I have a range of different things I can point to that contribute more and less. So if someone said, well, what would convince you? Well, no one thing would convince me, right? I'm pretty sure not one specific experience could do that. But
Right.
A kind of a range, a battery of repeated things in lots of different areas making me change my mind about it may do, right? I might change my mind. It just, no one thing would do, right? If I found out
the entire way you've explained it is very similar to every way I've heard you explain things, is about degrees of certainty. And this whole spider diagram that you described is all about creating like a web of thought.
Yeah.
So there is no single linchpin. There was no time when the spider had one leg,
Yeah.
and then suddenly, as soon as you break that last leg, you're suddenly a theist because your objections have all been met.
Yeah. Exactly. So I don't think there's one foundational belief at the heart of all of it that I have to take on faith and is unsupported by anything else. It seems to me that none of my beliefs are entirely unsupported, right? But some of them play more of a supporting role to others. Sort of basic views about things, the existence of the universe more than 3 seconds ago, right? I mean, it's compatible with all the evidence I have, but it just seems to me that like I feel quite strongly that it did exist more than 3 seconds ago. Well, I don't have any one thing that justifies that. It just coheres better with the rest of the things that I already believe. That I feel
isn't that the axiom of consciousness, which is why it sort of ignores all solipsistic arguments?
The axiom of consciousness, which is just like Descartes' cogito.
Well, not exactly. He came up with the idea, but he expressed it wrong, because the idea is that if you are conscious, you in order to prove that, you'd have to be conscious of something. So immediately you branch over from the consciousness is conscious axiom to existence exists axiom, and then the identity axiom. And then with those three, it's like consciousness and identity provides you existence, and consciousness provide identity and consciousness provide existence. There's a weird circle. I'll look it up. I didn't say that right. But the whole idea is that once you established the idea that you can only deal with the fact that you're conscious, you don't have a choice. On some level, the worrying about if you are a brain in an event is pointless, because you have to deal with the world as it is. So it becomes an axiom. And because you have to deal with the world as it is, you therefore have to start identifying things and dealing with things as defined terms. And so you start getting the laws of identity. And let me post what I'm talking about here. It's from a book I read. Very nice book. Covers this entire subject.
What's the book called?
This is a website that has most of the book on uploaded to it. So if you want to read it.
Cool.
I recently got in a conversation with someone, I forget his name, but he was clearly a presuppositionalist, because he was trying to use a lot of solipsistic arguments. And I didn't realize that by just stating as an axiom, the axiom of consciousness, that it completely ignored anything to do with solipsism, because there was no weight, no value to solipsism at that point.
Well, I mean, so the view I was just outlining then is sort of anti-foundationalist. So
Coherentism.
Yeah, it basically is a kind of coherentism. So it's points in the opposite direction from a view like that to talk about axioms really at all, right? So like so an axiom is something that's like taken to be true without having anything that's kind of supporting it to be true, right? It's like the starting point. Well, with this,
because the very act of attempting to disprove it would be, you'd have to use the components of the argument itself to disprove itself.
Well, not really. Well, yeah, I mean that's foundationalism. Sorry, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so I mean, on the view that I'm outlining, the model is very different to that. So I mean, and I take it some of the reasons for thinking that this is right is that the foundationist view is very much a post hoc construction, right? So when you're born, you don't just have one belief. You don't just start off with an axiom of existence or something, or an axiom of consciousness, and then slowly start inferring things that are logically entailed by that, or picked up by your sense perception or something like this kind of idea of the Cartesian rationalist, who's picking up knowledge like that. It's utterly unrealistic, and nobody lives their life like that. In fact, what happens is that what you do is kind of an impossible to describe properly process, but it's more like that. Sometime at some point in your life, you start to have a realization that you're very much conscious with a whole bunch of beliefs and an outlook or whatever, like 10 or 15 or something, right?
And at that point, you've established essentially the consciousness axiom that you are suddenly aware of it. You don't necessarily know why. It doesn't necessarily matter. It just is.
Well, I got a good analogy for this, Alex. Can I try to explain it?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so the way that I've heard this explained before, and I can't remember who it was that the difference between a foundationalist view and for example, like a coherentist view, would be the foundationalist view is that you start off with these axiomatic or these properly basic beliefs, okay?
Right. Okay.
And you can't justify them outside of any type of circular reasoning themselves. And now, within this map of a foundationalist viewpoint, the way that you justify a belief that you can say that you can know something is that it has to be predicated on some type of prior knowledge, okay? So you work your way back. So you know something because it's based on another piece of knowledge that you have. And you take this all the way back down to your foundation. And when you get to your foundation, you only hold it as a properly basic belief. You can't really say that you know it because there's nothing, because you've disrupted the chain. There's no prior knowledge to those properly basic beliefs that you can base those on. They just become the bedrock foundation of your epistemic framework.
Right. So
now,
should I be using
well, no, it's not that. There are some problems with foundationalism because people don't actually think like this. The better way to think of it would be something like imagine that you are a raft, that you're floating in a shipwreck, in the ocean, whatever, and the collection of beliefs that you hold are the things that are going to keep you afloat. Okay, so you add pieces of debris to your makeshift raft, and as long as you're maintaining buoyancy, say that your raft's working, that the whole series of beliefs that you have at this point in time are justified. And as you float out there, you'll take new pieces on, you'll cut old pieces off because you're always trying to maintain buoyancy. So in order to justify the system, okay, is the same way that you're justifying that the raft's working, that you're staying afloat in the water. So every single belief is justified from the collection of beliefs that you have. So there's no single axiomatic belief in there that's creating a foundation for why your raft's still floating. Everything is working together. You wouldn't say that you have an axiomatic belief, that you start off with consciousness and work from there. The belief that your consciousness works is justified because it's part of a coherent system of other beliefs that you have. Essentially,
yes, that's what I thought that said. I didn't think it was just a matter of like consciousness was base. It was consciousness is base only because it works with everything else.
Yeah, but the thing is, it wouldn't be an axiom at that point in time. There's no axiom in that system. Every single belief is supported by other beliefs that you have. You're not going down to any type of foundational,
Can you click
properly
on the
basic
link
belief.
and just put in chat and then tell me why I've got that wrong?
I'm on my phone. No, I think I'm on my phone. I can't do it right now. I think that where you get it wrong is where you just start describing a coherence theory of knowledge, and you start to throw in words like axioms, because there are none.
You don't accept that there are any axioms.
No, because an axiom is a starting point. An axiom point is something has to be laid out beforehand. Well, there is none in this. Like I said, the belief that you take as an axiom on a foundationalist viewpoint is just merely just another belief that's a part of a coherent set on a coherentist view.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I think I need to have my own chat with you guys about this because I'm not entirely certain how to view that in my head.
It just comes down to a question of what does it mean to justify a belief? In my mind, that's how I try to put it out there.
Well, let me read you what it says here, and you tell me why it's what's the stepping off point for what you're saying. It said under the heading of consciousness, it's like it starts talking about Descartes, saying that he argued that consciousness was axiomatic because you couldn't logically deny your mind exists at the same time as using your mind due to the denying. But his formulation and derivation of the axiom was wrong, and that he assumed that one can be aware without having something to be aware of. And consciousness, therefore, is the faculty that perceives that which exists. And because to be conscious is to perceive something, consciousness requires something outside of itself in order to function. Consciousness requires and is dependent upon existence. And that is where you then jump over to this axiom of consciousness then jumps over to the axiom of existence and explains how existence is necessarily a component of identifying something with your consciousness. And that's how you confirm that existence is real, sort of thing. Or that you're only concerned with things that qualify as things that exist.
So
should I read the existence one as well?
So I think that I mean, if I'm understanding that correctly, is that you're still trying to create a linear path, and I think that's the difference. Is that, like I said, when you look at the system like foundationalism compared to a system like coherentism, is that there's a linear path in foundationalism where, like they said, you're taking the consciousness and you're actually basing that on a prior piece of knowledge or prior belief before it. And within the coherentism viewpoint, you wouldn't be taking it off of a prior belief. There is no prior belief to that. It's that all the beliefs work in tandem with each other. So
I don't
it has
see
to do.
how it says that it's taking it off of something. It says outright that consciousness is the faculty that perceives that which exists. So how's that taking it off of something?
Wait, hold on. Consciousness is the faculty that perceives things which exist.
Right.
Well, I've had a dream before. I perceived an apple in there that wasn't real. So, I mean, this doesn't sound like a very good definition of consciousness, right? Because
no, actually, your problem there is the problem with exists. And you've already in another post specified that things that exist can exist physically or concepts. So your dreams would qualify as concepts.
Oh, so consciousness is awareness of concepts then?
Well, consciousness is the facility that perceives that which exists, is what's stated here, as long as you understand that what exists can be in the form of a physical object or a concept. So it's technically an unspecified term, but
yeah, I don't see that. That just seems just like an axiomatic belief there. I mean, like,
yeah, exactly. That's why I called it an axiom.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
It also seems quite misleading. I mean, like when I have, when I'm conscious of an apple that isn't really there,
that's a concept.
Well, but the apple that I thought was there didn't really exist.
Does it have to? You have a concept that it exists. Why is that now violated in some way?
The apple that but basically all I'm trying to say is that we want to remain it being true that the apple doesn't exist, right? That apple doesn't exist. I dreamt it.
No, it exists as a concept, even as a dream.
No, if I look at an apple that does exist, right,
then it exists
also
as a physical object.
But it also exists as a concept, right?
It can exist as both. There's no reason it can't exist.
So so in both cases, it exists as a concept. So when we want to say, what we're saying when we say, look, I had a dream about an apple, but there's no such apple, that apple doesn't exist, right? Which is a perfectly meaningful and respectable thing to say.
Right.
What we mean
is
that
you're being inconsistent.
Well,
you're saying exists as physical and then exists as concept. And you're equating the two as being the same thing.
Well, no, because it always exists as a concept, regardless if the apple is in front of you or not. Okay, it does exist as a concept first inside your mind, that you're conceptualizing something that's a part of reality. But you're not. But it doesn't allow you the ability to differentiate between a concept that exists merely in your mind and a concept that exists in your mind because you're observing it as a fact of reality. Now, there's a fact of reality that exists out there. It's that when we use the term "exist," we can use this in multiple different ways. Okay, and let's say that okay, yes, we agree that concepts do exist. The concept of the apple does exist, and in both cases where there is a reality where there's an apple and there isn't a reality, and there's a reality where there isn't an apple, the concept does exist. But in one of those realities, that the concept is being mapped to an actual physical part of a reality. So consciousness is doesn't by saying that consciousness is how did you phrase consciousness again there?
That which, consciousness is the faculty that perceives that which exists, which would include both concepts and existence.
So it's a process that perceives that which exists. That pretty much just says that consciousness is that which holds concepts. Like that, it doesn't map anything to an actual state of what is. In the sense that there's a physical thing out there.
You're making an equivocation again, because the moment you specify that existence only...
Yeah, no, I've already specified that. No, I've specified that's fine. Yeah, the concept exists. No one's denying that. It's that there's no way to differentiate now between something that is mapping a concept that exists, in the mind, and a concept that maps to reality. So the consciousness doesn't, what you're saying is the consciousness doesn't get you as far as to observe reality. All it does is consciousness gets you is to
then try to determine what existence is.
No, it just allows you to get to the stage that consciousness is the state that you're holding a thought. You're holding this idea of something, but it doesn't map to anything. It doesn't have to. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it doesn't have to, but that just becomes just a trivially true statement of what consciousness is. But it doesn't get you to a stage.
You can use it. It is a functional thing that can be applied.
Well, all it is, I think, is just a description of what consciousness is. Describing what something is doesn't justify it as an axiom. Like you can have a you can say that. Well, no, that's what. I know, but hold on. I'm just saying is that when you start off by saying that consciousness is that which perceives concepts, then okay, that's great. But that could be an axiom that you hold. But where's the part that this gets justified now that anything that you're observing has some type of tangible, measurable, physical reality?
This is the part where the other two axioms come into play. Just as consciousness brought you to the point of where you're considering what existence is, you then start dealing with this, what is called the axiom of existence, in which you acknowledge that existence at its very core indicates something rather than nothing. That if you're going to argue that existence that existence exists, you have to be stating about something. And so at that point is where you start making your delineations between the concept of an apple and the physical reality of an apple.
But you can't do that. That's the,
you just choose which one you're talking about.
Yeah, but no,
that's the whole act of identity.
Yeah, but you haven't been able to do this yet, because you haven't been able to, just be saying that you have a consciousness that can, process concepts out there doesn't necessarily mean that whatever that concept is has to map to something reality. And this is why it doesn't get around the problem of solipsism.
That's where existence comes in. It doesn't have to map to something into reality. You decide if it does or not, and you do that.
But how do you so how do you decide whether or not the concept that you observe is mapped to something reality or not?
Right. Okay. To exist in a physical sense, for example, it must, whatever it is you're talking about, has to be assigned an identity, because you can't be talking about something unless you've given it a description that everybody can sort of agree on. And that is where the second part, the existence exists, comes in.
Yeah, but well, hold on a second. But the problem with that one right there is, first off, the assumption that everyone can agree on also assumes that there's more than one mind out there. You could be the only. Yeah, so you're the only mind out there, and you have a concept of an apple, and it's hold on a second.
If you're the only mind out there, then everything is a concept within you.
Exactly. Yeah. So we haven't got to the point yet where we've established the how you're deciding that this is mapped to something in the external world.
Yes, the second you decide that it is not just a concept, you have created itself what is called here the existence axiom.
Yeah, but now you're just begging the question.
No, begging the question takes the conclusion of something and states that that's the reason it's found. But we're talking within. We've already established consciousness. We're taking the conclusion of that and moving it in a new argument.
No, begging the question is that you can derive the conclusion from one of the premises itself. Okay, and so one of the very first premise that you have there is that is the assumption that this thing could exist in the physical world or it could not exist in the physical world.
Technically, the initial assumption is that consciousness and identity indicate existence, and that existence and identity indicate consciousness.
You're assuming that by something having an identity is that it maps to a physical world.
No, you make that assumption that the only thing that you're caring about at this point in time is determining whether or not it maps to reality. Like you can start worrying about maps to concepts.
But you haven't established first off now that there's a reality that it could map to.
You've already established your conscious, which means
your consciousness
by definition have a reality.
You have a reality. You're part of reality. But when you're trying to differentiate between something that exists external of your mind or just as merely a concept of your mind, you still haven't gotten to the point where you've established that something can exist external of your mind.
If you are establishing that consciousness is your reality, like you are aware of you, you then have to either address or reject the idea that you are aware of anything.
Right, so you have to take on another axiom. Now you have to take another axiom on that an external world exists outside of your mind.
All you're doing though is taking on the idea of identity. That's all it takes. Because the moment
and concepts can have identities, right?
Sure. But if you're concerned only with concepts, you don't get very far. If you accept that existence can qualify as both a concept and a physical thing, that's the stepping off point.
Yeah, but that's dependent on the assumption that a concept can exist as a physical thing as well as the thing that the concept exists in your mind, but it's mapped to something that's in the physical reality.
Right, and so that's where the second axiom comes in, where you are simply stating that is what existence is that which maps to physical reality.
Yeah, so it's just another axiom that you're using. You're just
exactly.
Yeah, so you're just creating your. I mean that's foundationalism. You're just creating. You're laying out your different foundations right now, and that's fine. If for foundationalists to do that, you're working on certain. And one of those assumptions now is also that there is a physical world that's external of your mind.
Right. So essentially, that's why it's referred to as like a three axiom system. Because you accept that the whole axiom of identity matters, that it matters that you label things properly, and that by labeling them, you are using actual characteristics of that thing to label them, so that other people can look at the same thing that you're labeling and have the same identity, same understanding. So
okay, but now you get into another axiom. Okay, the other axiom on this one now is that there's other minds out there. Yeah, and is the last axiom that other minds exist?
No. That actually is irrelevant to the idea that you proceed as though you're making something that you're going to try to explain to someone else.
Right, but that's assuming that there's somebody else there that you could explain it to.
But
okay,
in the very
that's another axiom.
If you're explaining it to yourself first, so just so you can have the capacity of explaining it to someone else is not the goal. It's just one of the end products of having done the work of establishing it for yourself first.
So I think where we started off was in explaining a coherentist view. Then, Kerry, you said, "Oh, isn't that where the axiom of existence or whatever comes in?"
Right.
And I think now you've spelled that out a bit, and it's quite clear that part of the reason that that's not where the axiom of existence comes in is because that comes in a foundationalist picture, right? What you were describing is a type of foundationalism. So
I believe so, from what you've said. I didn't know that, but
yeah, that's right. An axiom is a dead giveaway, right? If a system's got an axiom in it, then it's foundational. It's got like a bottom level starting point, right?
Right.
And when a coherentist view doesn't have features like that. As Sokka was saying, it's not the case. So in a foundationalist view, every belief is justified by another belief, apart from the foundational beliefs that are not justified by anything. So an axiom of whatever is a belief that's held that doesn't need another belief justifying it for whatever reason.
Right.
On a coherentist view, there aren't any beliefs like that. Every belief is justified in some way by other beliefs, right? They hang together in a big picture, and there's no one part of it that's axiomatic that has to be taken without any support, right? There's
That opens you up to the whole brain in a vat concern, where that's not a concern here.
I'm sorry, what?
Well, no, it's not a concern on the coherentist view.
It's not.
Well,
That's not, like solipsistic arguments. Can they not be a problem with a coherentist view?
Look, part of the point on a coherentist view is that the belief that other minds exist and that the external world exists fits together as part of the picture that you have, right? So it's not that the belief that there are other minds or that the external world exists is proven by any other more foundational belief. It's just that the general outlook that you have, the picture that your web of beliefs paints, includes the belief that the other minds exist, right? That's my outlook. I have that as part of my beliefs. Now, if you say to me, well, why do you believe that? Well, maybe you're a zombie or something. Yeah, I can't point to one specific belief that counts as the justification for that, right? It's like I was describing, it's a spider diagram. It fits off with everything else. It's very easy for me to go about my daily life with other beliefs that I hold about, like, interacting with people like my parents and stuff. I mean, it helps that I believe that they're real existing physical things in order for me to, it makes sense out of my caring about them or whatever. If I thought they were just figments of my imagination, and it would like disrupt those other parts of my belief. So it makes sense with the rest of it. It like coheres together. So in a sense, it kind of sidesteps the problem of solipsism, which is like, provide me this like, justification for this foundational belief. Because we're just saying like, it's a different type of picture. I mean, like the whole thing has to be taken together. The worldview, if you like, or this web of beliefs comes as a package. You don't just take one bit and ask for the specific justification for that. It's just part of a picture that I accept. Right?
Isn't there something called foundationalism? Isn't that a combination of the two? Foundationalism and coherentism, or?
Yeah, I think Susan Hack's view. I don't know the details of it.
I think that may have been what first got me onto this. I just thought I was reading that instead of, like, the first thing it said was existence is an axiom because it's necessary for all knowledge. It can't be denied without conceding its truth. So in order to have knowledge, you have to have some kind of existence. And that just seemed obviously true. Like, basically, like a basic truth.
I just want to go back to the one thing that you said about, why is a problem, or why isn't the uniformity of nature, or the problem of whatever, why don't these exist in the same way in a coherentist viewpoint? And it stems down to the question that you'll hear from like presupposition. So we'll say things like, well, how do you know you're not a brain of that? Okay.
See, the whole point is irrelevant if consciousness is accepted as an axiom.
Well, okay. Ideally, yes. Okay. Ideally, there within these conversations, where from a foundationalist viewpoint, you lay out your foundational beliefs, and you say like, listen, if my foundational beliefs are true, that I can come to know things about reality. I can come to know things like that I'm not a brain of that. Right. But that's starting off assuming that the foundations that you're starting with are true. Now, the challenge that a lot of people that anti-foundationalists will put onto this is that when you start off with the foundationalist viewpoint, where in order to know something, it's got to be set on some type of prior knowledge until you get to, for example, like a foundational belief. Okay, is that foundational belief, because it only exists as a belief, that there's no prior knowledge to that you can justify it with, that they try to argue, or they will argue that therefore, because your foundations are beliefs, that you've broken your entire chain now. is that you can't know anything at the farther end because you're not actually starting off with the foundation of knowing something. So that's one of the challenges that they'll put towards foundationalism. There's something called the Munchausen trilemma. There's three horns trilemma that a foundationalist will take. But I mean, we'll just get away from that for a second. So when they ask a question like, how do you know that you're not just a brain of bat? What they're asking you to do is they're asking you to try to justify something that you take as an axiomatic belief. They're trying to get you to.
Why would you ever try to justify an axiom?
Well, see, that's the question. Is that when you start off and you say that you take something like that as an axiomatic belief, and then they ask you to try to justify it. All they're asking you to do is, hey, can you argue in a circle? Because you've already stated that this is something that you're taking on essentially as a properly basic belief. You're taking this on as a starting position there, and then they will argue that because you can't justify that, that therefore everything that follows cannot be said to be knowledge. Okay. Now, I don't agree with that line of argumentation on that.
Either. Given that the very statement that started this whole thing was that existence is an axiom, because that's the only way you can have knowledge is if you exist.
Yeah, that's fine. I think that providing that somebody grants you your axioms, you can come to know things. Okay, but there's no saying that within a discourse that somebody has to grant you your axioms.
True.
Okay, and so because of that,
but I also don't have to answer their solipsistic questions either.
Yeah, because you feel that in your own way that you start with these foundational beliefs, that therefore you're justified. That unless they can demonstrate why your axioms are, that you shouldn't hold them, that really that you can say that you know things from that. But this is where the conversation gets hung up, because these are common problems that anti-foundationalists will put towards foundationalists. Now, the reason though why this doesn't really apply within the coherence view on this is that when you say what justifies knowledge within a coherentist view, you're not justifying it based off of a prior belief or a set of beliefs that you can get down to an axiomatic belief. What justifies it is the whole system itself. Is that as long as the belief set that you have are all coherent, there's no internal contradictions within your set of beliefs that you have, then the entire set of beliefs can be said to be justified, which means that the entire set of beliefs can be made as knowledge claims. So I can say on a coherentist viewpoint that I know that I'm not a brain of bat. And if they ask, how do I know that I'm not a brain of bat? Well, then it just comes down to the fact that I'm a coherentist, that within my coherentist set of beliefs, that everything works together, that that I'm justified because the whole set supports the proposition that I'm not a brain of bat. And therefore the challenge of that you can't say that somebody that a coherentist has the same type of problem because they're not relying on this as an axiom. Where you have to challenge a coherentist viewpoint is whether or not beliefs that cohere together can be considered justification or not. But I mean, that just comes down to there's the different epistemic frameworks that people have.
Well, so yeah, because if you tried to claim that the coherent system melds together, they could try to argue that it's somehow circular.
In a way, it kind of is circular. It's not directly, it's not straightforwardly circular in the sense that you'd have P justifies Q and Q justifies P, and P justifies Q, Q justifies. It's not just straightforwardly a small circle like that, but it is a case of
A plus B equals C, B plus C equals A, and A and C equals B, or something like that, right?
I think it would still be more complicated than that as well, right? I mean, even then, that literally is a circle where the architecture of this wouldn't necessarily be circular, it would be more kind of web-like. I mean, in a sense, you can draw circles in a web, but okay, so in that sense, it's circular, but it's not the case that each and every belief is justified in a circle as small as 3 steps or something that you were saying a moment ago. But and I think it's also fair enough to say that, I mean, well, I don't think that on a coherentist picture, then the coherence of the picture means that you can claim knowledge about every element of it. I mean, that seems a bit strong. I guess I think it means more or less that you believe in the whole picture, and with differing levels of confidence. I mean, so you can still distinguish between the kind of more central claims, the ones that you're less likely to give up and you feel more confident about, and the kind of periphery ones. So, I mean, for instance, I park my car outside my house, but I can't currently see through the window. So, I mean, I believe it's there, but I could give or take that belief. It wouldn't really change much. I mean, maybe my girlfriend's come home and taken the car or something without me noticing, right? That could have happened. But then if you say to me something much more foundational, like foundational sounding, central to my rest of my beliefs that, the external world exists, or that contradictions can be true or something like this, then, I feel more confident that those things are true, but, so they strike me as a distinction I want to make between the central beliefs and the periphery ones. I guess I want to say that I believe the outside ones and I know the inside ones, or something like that. But ultimately they all hang together in a big. And it's very, very similar to how scientific theories are evaluated. Right? I mean, very often not decided on the turn of a decisive experiment, right? But most of the time, I mean, so let's say if you take an experiment. And you get a result that seems to be inconsistent with the theory that is currently accepted by the mainstream or something like that. It might be that you've simply proven that the theory is false, right? That the model is wrong in some way. But it might be that there's some other ad hoc auxiliary hypothesis you can tack on to that existing system that make somehow the telescope is bent or something. It's don't see the thing you're supposed to see, right? It doesn't mean you have to abandon relativity. You can just keep relativity and the fact that your observation didn't go as you expected it would do, by adding in an auxiliary hypothesis, right? And so at some point it becomes like the amount of extra things that you're tacking onto your theory makes it kind of cumbersome and difficult to keep going with that. And then you switch and move on to a different picture, like adopt a different paradigm or whatever. I mean, and that's how, so that the progression in scientific theories from one to the other is often a sort of messy period with people kind of trying to keep hold of a picture before eventually adopting another one only when they have to. And that's somehow like how we can change these fundamental beliefs. Like I probably could become a Christian, right? It probably could happen, but what would have to happen would be this process of me possibly trying to explain various things that happen. I feel like I see an angel, appear in front of me or something. I'm probably going to begin by saying something like, I must be dreaming, right? There's something going on here. And it would only be after a long time of me tagging on explanations for things that fit within the view that I hold at the moment before I would eventually possibly give up that and change the whole system or something, right? But so that it seems to me that that's...
If you, sorry, like the raft analogy that I was using is that you're now cutting pieces off and you're adding more pieces on. Like it's not just like you can't just do like one whole section. You're doing this individually. Like as new things come on, you're going to slowly warp the raft that you're floating on.
Yeah.
And the raft itself, though, is your properly basic.
No, it's all of my beliefs, all of them together.
Okay, so the raft, there is no single piece that's responsible for creating the initial buoyancy.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's no axiom.
All right. Well, then I probably am more of a foundational or a Foundationalism kind of believer.
Well,
I don't know. I'd have to think about it.
I'm not sure. Maybe Jack wants to, somebody can explain the middle ground position between foundationalism and coherentism, which is foundherentism. I don't really know anything about that, but I don't know if someone else wants to explain that for us.
I don't know a lot about it. I think half is fond of like the crossword puzzle analogy, if you're familiar with that.
No, sorry, I didn't hear you.
Can you get a bit closer to the mic? It's quite quiet.
Is that any better?
Yeah, that's much better, thanks.
I said I don't know a lot about foundherentism myself, but I just recall like Hack likes to use a crossword puzzle analogy. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
No, go for it.
Well, I mean, the basic idea is like when you're doing a crossword puzzle, like you've got, like the different words there. So you'll just start out with like putting a word in, and then other words in, and then each of those words will then support, well, then this should be the other word in here. So the pre-existing words will help you get other words in the crossword puzzle, and so on and so forth. So there's a tight interconnection between all the words you get, in which you can't really say one word is somehow more primary than the others. So in that sense, it's coherentist in that there's mutual, I guess you could say, warrant or support or whatnot among the answers. But I think the idea is supposed to be, don't take my word on it because I don't pretend to know a lot about coherentism. I think the idea is supposed to be that that web, that web as a whole or something, or that each of those individual components of that web are taken to be basic in the basic beliefs in the foundationalist sense. That leaves open that they could be fallible and revised later. But I guess the foundationalist part is that they start with the concept of basic beliefs, and the coherentist part is in terms of the nature of justification that Hack introduces for how beliefs can justify other beliefs or whatnot. It doesn't have to be a strictly derivative relationship.
I think I'm liking the sound of this more and more. It sounds very coherent.
I mean, I guess I don't understand what the purported advantage of this is, because it seems like the same sort of criticisms that you would voice against foundationalist beliefs found heretic.
You're breaking up.
Well, I think that what they're saying there is that so in like you said, within foundationalism, you don't try to justify your properly basic beliefs, and in coherentism, you don't have properly basic beliefs that you need to justify. What coherentism says is that we have properly basic beliefs, but the web that we have of all the other coherent beliefs we have do somehow support them. So I think it's not too different from just, I think it's more in line with coherentism than foundationalism. But I think that there's this little distinction there that they still allow the ability to hold a properly basic belief, but somehow now try to justify it, as if it's like, I don't know, like another horn of the Munchausen trilemma.
I think it's hard to comment on it without knowing exactly what it is, and it's not really something I've looked into. I'm not sure how prevalent it is in contemporary epistemology. People seem to be more concerned about foundationalist and traditional versions of traditional foundationalism and coherentism and whatnot.
In Reformed epistemology, there are properly basic beliefs.
I'm referring to coherentism specifically.
Yeah, I think that one of the main problems when it gets in these conversations is that you take something like foundationalism, which has been around for, I don't know, like 2,000 years, more or less, and then coherentism is still relatively new. I think less than 100 years old, and then you have coherentism, which I think came out in like the late 70s. So I mean, it's still, these other like epistemic frameworks are still kind of finding their own ground, their own kind of supports out there. So there's less kind of less information that you can find on them, or less people that are proponents of those positions.
Well, if it was forever settled, I don't think it'd be half as much fun. But man, I have stuff to.
I think Ozymandias is a found herentist, from what I understand. I don't know though. He probably be the better person to talk to on it.
No, I'd love to chat him up. That'd be very interesting to see what his take on it is.
Well, I mean, on that note, Alex, thanks for the invite, but I got to take off. I'll talk to you guys later.
It was fun. Was there anything else anyone wanted to talk about, or are we pretty much done?
Well, I came in late in the conversation. Were you guys just talking about the different theories of justification and whatnot throughout the
Well,
conversation?
like all good conversations, it kind of wandered a bit. The initial conversation was between Alex and NP, and they were discussing how to properly label and identify the various kinds of atheism. And the general consensus, I think, at the end was to just basically acknowledge that some questions are umbrella questions, and if you give an umbrella reply, you can't complain. You essentially have to ask a more specific question if you're looking for a more specific answer. I don't want to speak for Alex, though, so maybe you want to send him a message of some sort and ask him to give his summary
I
of the
think he stepped
conversation.
away for a moment.
Ah, okay.
He's still in the,
Well,
the
once
hangout.
that part of the conversation was over, that's what I took from it. And therefore, I started asking questions concerning how people basically make identity as part of their philosophy, I suppose, is how do you treat identity? Because foundationalism treats identity as an axiom, and it also treats certain other things as axioms. And within that, those like three axioms it states, it creates this web. And as soon as we started talking about that, that's where coherentism got jumped in the idea that there were certain problems found in foundationalism that were sort of, you could sidestep with coherentism. And that, of course, led to the discussion of foundheretism, which is a combination of the two. That's the long story short summary.
Thank you.
So yeah, I'm going to step out because I have a bunch of stuff to read now, and I'd like to make heads or tails of it. Talk to you guys
Take
later.
care.
Okay, so I think I'm going to stop the broadcast at this point, but welcome to keep going if you want to. Has anyone's got any objections?
So, I mean, were you guys, I think Carrie was sort of summarizing it earlier, but I think he wanted me to confer with you on something. Were you guys just basically discussing the different theories of justification or something?
Only quite tangentially. I mean, we didn't really get into anything particularly substantive. We just, I really just described a sort of vague coherentist outlook, to contrast with the foundationalist one. But we didn't get onto anything, as interesting as justification versus warrant, or internalist versus externalist, or anything juicy like that. It's quite happy to talk about that type of thing now.
Do you have any particular views on that?
Well, I suppose I was kind of vaguely drawn towards externalism when I first heard about it, although I think I'm increasingly sympathetic to the sort of thing that Jack's, it for one, has expressed doubts about it to me, along the lines of, like, justification on an externalist criteria is just a completely different type of thing, right? So an externalist doesn't so much solve problems about justification, but just changes topic and talks about a different thing altogether. And I suppose, in a sense, something that's kind of put me off externalism to some extent. I'm happy to be talked back into it if it seems like I'm missing something really obvious.
I mean, I think the basic upshot with externalism is that it's supposed to give you a way of getting getting something like the truth. I mean, like, even if you don't think knowledge is JTB, I mean, most theorists think that well, first of all, it will be factive, so it involves truth. And secondly, most theorists would think that some notion of justification plays some role in it. So I guess with externalism, you at least get something like, these beliefs will actually connect to truth in some robust way. But the issue seems to be that, like you're saying, that it doesn't seem to be talking about justification in the way that we think about it. But I think conversely, that if you take like the internalist stance on things, you think about justification in this sort of typical internalist way, like the things like the new evil demon problem, like the idea is supposed to be that if we were like brains in a vat or deceived by an evil demon, we would have just the same amount of justification for our beliefs now as we would in that situation. But then that notion of justification seems to be completely disconnected from truth. And in that sense, knowledge doesn't seem to be really doing anything in that system. If we can be just as justified with everything being, pretty much all of our beliefs being false, as opposed to them being mostly true. So I'm not sure if there's obviously there's a lot of more nuanced things you can say regarding both and in the middle, but I mean, to me, I think that's sort of the very basic sort of dilemma, which is if you go with externalism, then you have sort of a way of, I guess, actually ensuring that your beliefs turn out to be factive, but it's hard to understand them as knowledge because, I mean, it's going to be phrased almost always as a conditional, like if X is in place, then you have knowledge, or if there is in fact a reliable mechanism, blah blah blah, connecting to these facts, then you have knowledge, or if you were designed by some design plan aimed at truth, then you have true beliefs, etc. Right? But as an externalist, you have no way of verifying the antecedent of that conditional. You can just say, well, I mean, it almost comes down to being as trivial as saying, like, if the conditions for me having knowledge are in place, then I have knowledge. But you don't know the antecedent, so it seems almost kind of useless in that sense. But conversely, if you're an internalist, then it doesn't seem, you can have justification, but it doesn't seem to be connected to truth and therefore knowledge in that sense. That's always been sort of the puzzle for me in a nutshell.
So do you have a preferred theory then, given your insight?
Not really. I mean, I'd like to have a view that, I mean, I've been looking into something like Williamson's knowledge first epistemology, but I find that very weird to get my head around. So I don't really have a preferred or particular view there. I mean, a radical solution might be rejecting the sort of picture of truth that most understanding of knowledge consist in, which is that if you think of propositions, the truth conditions of them corresponding to some correspondence between a given belief and some fact in the world, then there's always going to be this question. There's a certain sense in which there's a certain veil between what you believe and what the world is like. And then there's a question of matching the two up in order to get knowledge. But if you retreat into, you can move away from that kind of representationalism into something like a pragmatic understanding, or I think like Brandom, like he's big on inferential role semantics, then the truth condition propositions are going to consist not in terms of correspondence between, word and world, but something like it being able to license certain inferences or something like that. But that seems pretty deflationary, so I'm not sure what to think about that either, but it's maybe one way of getting around or dissolving the puzzle, I guess you could say.
It's interesting. It's a really complicated area, I think. I think it's also a bit of a mess as well. Like, philosophy doesn't have anything like a consensus on these issues at the moment.
Well, I mean, isn't that true for almost any area in philosophy?
I think it's true of this area now, and I'm not so sure that it used to be true. I think that people people have been talking about knowledge for a long time, of course, but isn't it the case that up until Gettier, most people just took something like a JTB account to be broadly right, and ever since Gettier, then that kind of like blew up the discourse, and now there's a whole bunch of different positions on the table that people like. Without Gettier, can you even imagine Plantinga having any of his project at all? It seems to me that no one would have bothered thinking about warrant as opposed to justification without Gettier.
Yeah, that's something I've never quite understood, though, which is that Gettier, well, I don't know if it's Gettier or Gettier or whatever, but that Gettier, that it took so long, comparatively speaking, for that to be a thing in epistemology. Because I would imagine it would have cropped up in some fashion. I wouldn't be surprised if you go through the history of philosophy, something like that has cropped up. I think some people have said that Socrates had inklings of it all the way back in the Theaetetus, where he introduces the JTB account to begin with. So I guess people just ignored it or something.
Yeah, that's probably true. There's always some guy out there that's already thought whatever idea it is that you've had. There's always someone who's had that idea, but before you.
Pretty much.
Pretty much. But that means that there must have been a first idea maker. I've just come up with a new proof that God exists. Okay, well, look, I'm going to end the broadcast now because I need to start getting on with stuff anyway. So thanks very much for coming. I'll leave the hangout on. I'm just going to stop the broadcast.
All right.